Who let this black kid in here? The words sliced through advanced number theory like a blade, and every head in the lecture hall turned toward the back row. Professor Malcolm Weller stood at the podium with a smile that promised cruelty, his finger aimed at 19-year-old Deshaun Reed like a loaded weapon. You, Weller announced, his voice dripping with false generosity, are about to solve an impossible equation. Get it right. Automatic A. Get it wrong? He paused for effect. Full letter grade deduction, right now. The room went silent as a grave. Deshaun's hands trembled in his lap because he knew this wasn't about math. It was about making him disappear. What Professor Weller didn't know was that Deshaun had been solving graduate-level problems since he was 15, hidden genius wrapped in deliberate mediocrity, carrying secrets in notebooks that belonged to a father the world had forgotten. And the equation Weller was about to write, Deshaun had seen it before. If you're invested in seeing how Deshaun turns his humiliation into power, stay with me until the very end. Like this story and comment what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this journey has traveled. The September morning had started like any other Tuesday, which meant Deshaun Reed was already calculating how to be invisible. He'd perfected the art over 3 semesters at Ashford University, a prestigious institution where the limestone buildings seemed to whisper that people who looked like him were guests, not residents. Deshaun had learned to sit in the back, speak only when directly called upon, and most importantly, keep his grades hovering in that sweet spot of B+ competence, good enough to stay enrolled, unremarkable enough to avoid attention. Attention was dangerous. Attention meant questions. Questions meant exposure. And exposure meant becoming a target. So when he walked into advanced number theory that morning, his routine was automatic. Last row, 3rd seat from the left, next to the window where he could watch the campus green instead of making eye contact with classmates who never quite knew what to do with him. The class was small, only 23 students, most of them white, most of them legacy admits whose families had buildings named after them. Deshaun was there on a partial scholarship pieced together with 2 part-time jobs and a prayer. Professor Malcolm Weller swept into the room at exactly 9:02 a.m., 2 minutes late as always, as if punctuality was beneath someone of his stature. At 56, Weller cut an impressive figure. Silver hair, perfectly groomed, tailored suit that probably cost more than Deshaun's tuition, and the kind of confident swagger that came from 30 years of academic dominance. He'd published 17 books, held an endowed chair, and had a reputation for brilliance that bordered on mythology. He also had a reputation for something else, though it was spoken about in whispers. He didn't think certain people belonged in advanced mathematics. "Ladies and gentlemen," Weller began, setting his leather briefcase on the desk with deliberate precision, "today we continue our exploration of elliptic curves and their relationship to Fermat's last theorem. I trust you've all completed the reading I assigned, all 87 pages of Wiles's proof annotations." Deshaun had completed it. He'd done more than complete it. He'd found 3 errors in the textbook's interpretation and had written a 4-page analysis in the margins of his own copy. But he'd never mentioned that, never volunteer that information, because that would mean being seen. The lecture proceeded normally for the first 30 minutes. Weller moved through the material with the ease of someone who'd taught it 100 times, occasionally calling on students to answer questions. When he called on Jessica Hartwell, she stumbled through an explanation of modular forms. When he called on Brandon Chen, Brandon confidently discussed the Taniyama-Shimura conjecture. Weller praised them both, his smile warm and encouraging. He never called on Deshaun. He never even looked at Deshaun. This was normal. This was safe. This was exactly what Deshaun wanted. Until 9:47 a.m., when everything changed. Weller had been mid-sentence discussing the relationship between rational points and group theory when he suddenly stopped. His gaze swept across the classroom slowly, deliberately, like a predator selecting prey. And then his eyes landed on Deshaun. For 3 full seconds, they just stared at each other. Deshaun felt his stomach tighten, that familiar anxiety that came whenever someone looked at him too long, too hard, as if trying to solve the puzzle of his presence. "You," Weller said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of note-taking and laptop typing. "In the back, with the hood." Deshaun wasn't wearing a hood. He had on a plain navy blue sweater, crew neck, no hood in sight. But he knew better than to correct a professor. especially this professor, especially in front of everyone. Yes, sir, Deshaun said, his voice carefully neutral. Weller's smile was slow, predatory. I've been teaching this course for 23 years. Do you know what I've noticed in all that time? The question hung in the air like a noose. Deshaun said nothing. I've noticed, Weller continued, walking slowly down the aisle toward the back of the room, toward Deshaun, that some students enroll in advanced courses not because they're prepared, but because they think it looks good on a transcript. Padding, if you will. And those students inevitably struggle, inevitably fail, inevitably waste everyone's time, including mine. The classroom had gone completely silent. Even the laptop typing had stopped. 22 pairs of eyes turned toward Deshaun, some curious, some embarrassed for him, some relieved they weren't the target. Professor, Jessica Hartwell said quietly from the front row, we should probably get back to the... We'll get back to the material when I'm ready, Ms. Hartwell. Weller didn't even glance at her. His eyes remained fixed on Deshaun. I'm addressing a matter of academic integrity, of appropriate placement, of ensuring that students are in classes suited to their actual abilities rather than their aspirations. Deshaun's hands were folded on his desk, perfectly still, but inside his chest, his heart was hammering. He knew where this was going. He'd seen this movie before. Different actors, same script. The script that said he didn't belong, that his presence was a mistake, that someone should escort him back to wherever people like him were supposed to be. Now then, Weller said, reaching Deshaun's row and stopping directly beside his desk. Up close, Deshaun could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp, like cedar and entitlement. Let's have a little demonstration. A teaching moment, if you will, for the entire class. Professor Weller, Brandon Chen interjected from the middle of the room. Is this really... Mr. Chen, I don't recall asking for your input. Weller's voice had hardened into something cold and final. Unless you'd like to volunteer to take this young man's place. Brandon fell silent. Weller turned back to Deshaun, and his smile returned. But it wasn't a smile. Not really. It was the expression of someone about to enjoy something cruel. Here's what we're going to do, Weller announced, addressing the whole class now while still standing over Deshaun's desk. I'm going to write a problem on the board. Not a simple problem. Not even a difficult problem. An impossible problem. One that broke 3 PhD candidates I advised over the years. One that represents the absolute ceiling of what can be achieved in this particular subset of number theory. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. And our friend here, he gestured at Deshaun without looking at him, is going to solve it. Right now. At the board. In front of everyone. Deshaun felt something cold slide down his spine. Professor, I don't think... Oh, but I do think. I think this is a perfect opportunity for assessment, for understanding whether you're in the right place. Weller's voice took on a tone of false generosity. And to make it interesting, let's add some stakes. Solve this problem, and I'll give you an automatic A for the entire semester. You can stop coming to class, stop doing homework, stop taking exams. An A, guaranteed. Someone in the front row gasped. An automatic A in Weller's class was unheard of. He was notorious for his harsh grading, his impossible standards. Students fought for B's like they were Olympic medals. However, Weller continued, and there it was, the trap closing. If you cannot solve it, you lose a full letter grade on your current standing, immediately. So if you're at a B, you drop to a C. If you're at a C, he shrugged eloquently. Well, you understand the mathematics of failure, I presume. That's not fair, someone whispered. Deshaun couldn't see who. Life isn't fair, Weller replied sharply. But mathematics is. Mathematics doesn't care about fairness, it cares about truth. And we're about to discover the truth about whether this young man belongs in advanced number theory. Deshaun sat frozen. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to refuse, to walk out, to call the department chair, to do anything except participate in this public execution masquerading as pedagogy. But he also knew the calculus of survival at Ashford University. If he refused, Weller would fail him anyway. Would say he wasn't participating, wasn't engaged, wasn't serious. At least this way there was a chance to do what he'd been hiding for 3 years. All right, Deshaun heard himself say, and his voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. I'll do it. Weller's smile widened. Excellent. Come to the board. Deshawn stood on legs that felt like water. Every step down the aisle toward the front of the classroom felt like walking toward a gallows. He could feel everyone watching him, could feel their pity and discomfort and morbid curiosity. Jessica Hartwell looked away when he passed her desk. Brandon Chen mouthed, "You don't have to do this." But he did. He did have to do this because that was the bargain people like him made every day. Perform when called upon. Prove yourself repeatedly. Earn your space in rooms that were never designed to hold you. When he reached the front, Weller handed him a piece of chalk with exaggerated ceremony. "Don't worry," the professor said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "There's no shame in not knowing what you don't know. Sometimes our reach exceeds our grasp. It's a valuable lesson." Then Weller turned to the massive blackboard that took up the entire front wall and began to write. The equation emerged line by line, symbol by symbol, a serpentine construction of variables and functions that seemed to grow more complex with each passing second. It involved elliptic curves, modular forms, Galois representations, and a series of transformations that would make most graduate students weep. Weller wrote quickly, confidently, clearly having memorized this particular torture device. When he finally stepped back, the equation sprawled across the board like a mathematical monster. A twisted series involving L functions, complex multiplication, and a peculiar constraint on the conductor that made the whole thing teetering on the edge of unsolvable. "There," Weller said, setting down his chalk and dusting off his hands. "Take your time. You have, let's say, 15 minutes. That should be more than enough time to either solve it or admit defeat gracefully." Deshawn stared at the board and felt the world tilt sideways. Because he'd seen this equation before. Not exactly this equation. Weller had modified some of the parameters, changed some of the notation, but the structure was identical. The same cruel twist in the middle where most people would hit a wall. The same elegant trap in the final constraint that made traditional approaches impossible. He'd seen it in the notebooks. His father's notebooks. 3 years ago, when his grandmother had died, Deshawn had been tasked with cleaning out her attic. It was there, in a dusty cardboard box labeled James Reed Personal, that he'd found them. 17 leather-bound notebooks filled with mathematical proofs, theorems, and problems. His father's handwriting, careful and precise, covering page after page with equations that Deshawn initially couldn't understand. James Reed, a name Deshawn barely knew. A man who died when Deshawn was 3 years old, leaving behind only absence and silence. His mother never talked about his father. His grandmother would change the subject whenever Deshawn asked. It was as if James Reed had been erased from family history, too painful or too shameful to remember. But those notebooks told a different story. They revealed a brilliant mathematician, someone who'd been working on problems that were decades ahead of their time. And as Deshawn had taught himself advanced mathematics over the following 3 years, using his father's notes as a secret curriculum, he'd begun to understand just how gifted James Reed had been. One of those notebooks, the one with the coffee stain on the cover, contained this exact class of problem. And in the margin, in his father's handwriting, was a note that had haunted Deshawn ever since he'd read it. Solved. Method C. Weller said it was impossible, proved him wrong. He didn't like that. Deshawn's hands had started to sweat. Behind him, he could hear the classroom settling into uncomfortable silence, students shifting in their seats, waiting for him to fail. Weller had retreated to his desk, arms crossed, expression smug with anticipated victory. 15 minutes, Weller had said. Deshawn picked up the chalk, and he saw his father's hand guiding his own, heard his father's voice whispering through the years. Method C. Start with the transformation. He began to write. The first step was recognizing that the L function could be decomposed using a specific automorphic form, not the obvious one that Weller had baited in the problem, but a hidden one that only revealed itself if you approached from a completely different angle. Deshawn's chalk moved across the board, fast and certain. The second step was applying a transformation that most mathematicians wouldn't even consider because it seemed to add complexity rather than reduce it. But that was the trap. Sometimes you had to go through chaos to reach clarity. More symbols, more lines. The equation was evolving, transforming. Behind him, he heard someone whisper, "Is he actually doing it?" The third step was where his father's genius truly showed. A novel application of complex multiplication that created a shortcut through what seemed like an impossible maze. It was elegant, brutal in its efficiency, the kind of insight that separated good mathematicians from great ones. Deshaun was barely breathing now. His entire world had narrowed to the board, to the chalk, to the proof unfolding before him like a flower opening in fast forward. 30 seconds left, by his internal count. The final step required recognizing that the conductor constraint wasn't actually a constraint at all. It was a revelation. When properly interpreted, it eliminated 3 entire branches of the problem tree, leaving only one path forward. And that path led directly to the solution. Deshaun wrote the final line, the answer emerging like sunlight after a storm. A single, elegant expression that reduced all that complexity into something almost beautiful in its simplicity. He set down the chalk. The entire solution had taken 94 seconds. For a moment, nothing happened. The classroom was so quiet, Deshaun could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. He turned around slowly, his heart still pounding, and saw 22 faces staring at him in various states of shock. Weller hadn't moved from his desk. His arms were still crossed, but his expression had changed. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by something else, something that looked almost like fear. Then Brandon Chen started clapping. It started as a slow, solitary sound, but within seconds, others joined in. Jessica Hartwell stood up, still clapping. Then Marcus Thompson from the second row. Then Sarah Kim. Within 30 seconds, half the class was on their feet, applauding like Deshaun had just performed a magic trick. But Deshaun wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Weller. The professor had finally moved. He'd walked to the board, his eyes scanning the proof line by line, searching desperately for an error, a mistake, any flaw he could use to discredit what had just happened. His finger traced the transformations, his lips moving silently as he verified each step. Deshaun watched him find nothing, because there was nothing to find. The proof was airtight. "Where did you learn this?" Weller's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the sudden silence after the applause died down, everyone heard it. "I taught myself," Deshaun said carefully. "No." Weller's finger was still on the board, pointing at the third transformation. "This method, this specific approach. Where did you learn it?" Something in the professor's voice made Deshaun's scalp prickle. It wasn't curiosity. It was something darker, something urgent. "My father taught me," Deshaun said, and he watched Weller's hand freeze in midair. "Your father." Weller turned slowly, his face carefully neutral now, professional curiosity replacing the earlier emotion. "And who is your father? What's his name?" The classroom was watching this exchange like spectators at a tennis match, heads turning back and forth, sensing something beneath the surface but not understanding what. Deshaun hesitated. His mother had been clear. Don't talk about James Reed. Don't ask questions. Don't dig into the past. The past was buried for a reason. But standing there, with the proof on the board behind him, with his father's brilliance proven in chalk and logic, Deshaun felt something shift inside him, a door that had been locked his entire life suddenly cracking open. "James Reed," he said clearly. "My father was James Reed." The effect on Professor Malcolm Weller was instantaneous and unmistakable. His face didn't just change, it cracked. For exactly 1 second, maybe 2, his professional mask shattered completely, and what showed through was raw, primal fear. His skin went pale, his eyes widened, his mouth opened slightly, as if he was about to say something, then closed again. Then, just as quickly, the mask slammed back into place. But Deshaun had seen it. That flash of recognition, that moment of terror. "Class dismissed," Weller said abruptly. "Everyone out, now." "But Professor," Jessica started, "we still have 20 minutes. "I said out." Weller's voice cracked like a whip, and this time there was no mistaking the emotion in it. Anger, yes, but also something else. Panic. Students scrambled for their bags, shooting confused glances at each other as they hurried toward the door. Brandon paused next to Deshaun. "Hey man, that was incredible. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Deshaun managed, though he wasn't sure if that was true. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up with him. You should celebrate. That was legendary. Brandon clapped him on the shoulder and followed the others out. Soon it was just Deshawn and Weller, alone in the empty lecture hall. The proof still stood on the board behind them, silent witness to what had just transpired. Weller had returned to his desk and was gripping its edge with both hands, like he needed physical support. He was staring at Deshawn with an expression that was difficult to read, part calculation, part fear, part something that might have been grief. "James Reed," Weller said finally, testing the name like it might explode in his mouth. "Your father." "Yes, sir." "He's deceased?" "Died when I was 3, 22 years ago." Deshawn didn't add the details he'd pieced together from overheard conversations and sealed records that his father had died by suicide, alone in a cheap apartment, his brilliance buried with him in an unmarked grave. That mystery had haunted Deshawn his whole life. Something flickered across Weller's face. "I see." "Did you know him?" Deshawn asked, though he already knew the answer. That reaction had told him everything he needed to know. "I knew him," Weller said carefully. "Briefly, years ago. He was—" The professor paused, choosing his words with surgical precision. "He was a graduate student. Promising, but troubled. Very troubled." "Troubled how?" "That's not really relevant to your current situation, Mr. Reed." Weller had regained some of his composure now, though his hands were still gripping the desk edge. "What is relevant is that you've demonstrated remarkable mathematical ability today. Truly remarkable." The sudden shift to praise felt wrong, artificial, like watching someone put on a mask. "Thank you," Deshawn said cautiously. "However," and there it was, the turn, "I have concerns." "What kind of concerns?" Weller finally released the desk and walked to the window, his back to Deshawn. "That method you used, method C you called it, is not something you would find in any textbook. It's not even something you'd find in graduate-level coursework. It's highly specialized, highly advanced work." "My father developed it." "Perhaps." Weller turned back to face him, and his expression had shifted again. Now it was the look of a professor conducting an investigation. "Or perhaps someone else did. Perhaps your father learned it from someone else. Perhaps you learned it from someone else." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. "You think I cheated," Deshawn said flatly. "I think," Weller replied carefully, "that mathematical prodigies are extremely rare. And when someone demonstrates abilities that seem to come from nowhere, with no prior indication, no history of exceptional performance, it raises questions. I solved it in 94 seconds, in front of the entire class. How exactly would I have cheated?" "There are many ways," Weller said, and his voice had taken on a professorial tone now, as if he was explaining a theorem. "Prior knowledge of the problem, unauthorized collaboration, hidden notes, smart devices, the list goes on." Deshawn felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sharp. "You gave me chalk and a board. I had nothing else." "What you had, Mr. Reed, was access to material that raises serious questions about academic integrity, material that may not have been obtained through legitimate channels." "My father's notebooks?" "If they exist, Weller held up a hand before Deshawn could explode. "I'm not making accusations. I'm simply saying that given the extraordinary circumstances, your previously unremarkable performance in this class, your sudden demonstration of advanced capabilities, the questionable provenance of your methods, I have a responsibility to investigate." "This is bullshit," Deshawn said, and he didn't care that he was swearing at a professor. "You tried to humiliate me. You set a trap. And now that I didn't fall into it, you're trying to destroy me anyway." "I'm trying to protect the integrity of this institution," Weller replied, and his voice had gone cold. All pretense of concern dropped. "And if that means conducting a thorough investigation into potential academic dishonesty, then that's exactly what I'll do." "You know I didn't cheat." "What I know," Weller said, moving toward the door, "is that I'll be contacting the Academic Integrity Board. They'll want to interview you. You'll want to bring any evidence you have of your claimed self-study. If you can prove that your father's supposed notebooks exist and contain the material you claim, then perhaps we can resolve this matter quickly." He paused with his hand on the door handle. "But if you can't prove it, Mr. Reed, then we have a serious problem. Academic dishonesty is grounds for immediate expulsion from Ashford University. No appeals, no second chances. You understand? Deshaun understood perfectly. The trap hadn't closed when he failed to solve the equation. It had closed when he succeeded. One more thing, Weller added, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, almost pitying. Your father, James Reed. If he really did develop that method, if those notebooks really exist, you might want to ask yourself why no one else has ever heard of him, why his work was never published, why a brilliant mathematician died alone and forgotten. The professor's eyes met Deshaun's, and there was something in them that made Deshaun's blood run cold. Sometimes, Weller said quietly, there are very good reasons why certain people don't succeed in mathematics, reasons that have nothing to do with ability. Then he left, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking. Deshaun stood alone in the empty lecture hall, his proof still on the board, his future suddenly hanging by a thread he couldn't see. And for the first time since he'd opened those dusty notebooks 3 years ago, he understood that his father hadn't just left behind mathematical problems. He'd left behind a mystery, and that mystery had just woken up. Deshaun walked home in a daze, his mind spinning through the confrontation like it was a proof he couldn't quite complete. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching under his feet, as he made his way off campus and into the neighborhood where he shared a cramped apartment with 2 roommates. But he didn't go to the apartment. His feet carried him somewhere else, somewhere he'd been avoiding for 3 years. His mother's house, 45 minutes away by bus. The ride gave him time to think, to remember, to question everything he thought he knew about his father and his own carefully constructed invisibility. His mother, Diane Reed, lived in a small 2-bedroom house in a working-class neighborhood that had seen better days. She worked as a nurse at County General, pulling double shifts to keep the mortgage paid and food on the table. She'd raised Deshaun alone after his father died, and she'd done it with fierce determination and an equally fierce silence about the man whose name Deshaun carried. When Deshaun knocked on her door at 3:47 p.m., she answered with flour on her hands and concern in her eyes. "Baby, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" "I need to talk to you," Deshaun said. "About Dad." Diane's expression shifted immediately, closing off like shutters slamming over windows. "Deshaun, I've told you—" "Someone knew him, Mom. Someone at the university. My professor." Deshaun pushed past her into the house, into the living room that smelled like fresh bread and laundry detergent. "Professor Malcolm Weller. When I said Dad's name, Mom, he was terrified. What happened? What aren't you telling me?" Diane closed the door slowly, her back to him. When she turned around, she looked 10 years older. "How did Professor Weller's name come up?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "He tried to humiliate me in class, made me solve an impossible problem in front of everyone. But I solved it using Dad's methods from the notebooks. And when I told him Dad taught me, Deshaun stopped, studying his mother's face. "You know him. You know Weller." It wasn't a question. Diane moved to the couch and sat down heavily. "Make some tea," she said. "This is going to take a while." 20 minutes later, they sat across from each other, mugs of tea cooling between them, and Diane Reed told her son the truth she'd been hiding for 22 years. "Your father was brilliant," she began. "The kind of brilliant that comes along maybe once in a generation. He was working on problems that professors twice his age couldn't solve. Everyone in the mathematics department at Ashford knew he was special. Then why isn't he famous? Why have I never heard his name in any mathematics context?" Diane's jaw tightened. "Because Malcolm Weller destroyed him." The words hung in the air like an accusation and a confession all at once. "Your father was Weller's graduate student," Diane continued, her voice steady but her hands shaking around her mug. "Weller was his thesis advisor. James trusted him completely, showed him everything he was working on, every breakthrough, every new method, including Method C." Deshaun felt something cold spreading through his chest. What did Weller do? "He stole it. All of it." Diane's voice cracked. "Your father had developed a revolutionary approach to certain classes of number theory problems, work that should have made him a legend. But before James could publish, before he could even finish his dissertation, Weller published a paper under his own name, used all of James's methods, all of his insights, but claimed them as his own work. That's impossible. There are safeguards. Advisors can't just— They can if they're smart about it, Diane interrupted. And Weller was very smart. He changed just enough to make it look different. He buried the similarities under technical language. And when James tried to fight back, tried to prove the work was his, Weller did something worse. What? He accused James of plagiarism. Diane's eyes were wet now, tears threatening to fall. He told the department that James had stolen the methods from him, that James had betrayed his trust as an advisor. He manufactured evidence, emails, drafts with altered dates, testimony from other faculty who owed him favors. And because Weller was established, respected, powerful, everyone believed him. Deshawn felt like he couldn't breathe. What happened to Dad? They expelled him, stripped his credentials, made sure no other university would touch him. Your father went from being a rising star to being branded a thief and a fraud. He couldn't get a teaching position, couldn't even get published in legitimate journals. Everything he'd worked for, everything he was just gone. But he still had the notebooks. He could have proven who was going to listen. Diane's voice had risen, anger breaking through grief. A disgraced black graduate student with no credentials versus a celebrated white professor with 30 years of reputation? James tried, baby. He tried for 2 years to clear his name. He sent letters to every mathematics organization, every journal, every professor he'd ever known. Most didn't respond. The ones who did told him to move on, that fighting Weller would only hurt him more. Deshawn thought about the notebooks in his apartment, about the careful handwriting, about the brilliance that had taught him everything he knew about mathematics. He thought about the man he'd never really known, the father who was just a ghost and a name. He killed himself because of this, Deshawn said quietly. Diane nodded, tears falling now. 2 years after the expulsion. He'd moved out. We'd separated because he couldn't handle being around people anymore. The shame ate him alive, baby. Not the shame of doing something wrong, but the shame of being called a liar when he was telling the truth. The shame of being destroyed by someone he trusted. Why didn't you tell me? What was I supposed to say? Diane wiped her eyes roughly. Your father was brilliant and the world broke him? That the system he believed in betrayed him? That the university you're attending right now protected the man who murdered your father's spirit? She shook her head. I wanted you to have a chance, Deshawn. A fair chance, without the weight of that history crushing you before you even started. So you let me be invisible instead, Deshawn said, and he understood it now. Why his mother had never pushed him to excel, why she'd seemed almost relieved when he maintained average grades, why she'd never asked about his secret notebooks or his late-night mathematics sessions. She'd been trying to protect him, trying to keep him from being destroyed the same way his father had been. I thought if you stayed under the radar, if you didn't attract attention, you'd be safe, Diane said. I thought you could get your degree, get a good job, live a good life without ever having to face what happened to James. But I can't do that anymore. Deshawn stood up, pacing the small living room. Weller knows who I am now. He knows I have Dad's methods, and he's going to try to destroy me too. What do you mean? Deshawn explained the confrontation, the accusation of cheating, the pending investigation. With every word, his mother's face grew more horrified. We have to fight this, Diane said when he finished. We have to prove— Prove what, Mom? That Dad's notebooks exist? Weller will just say Dad stole those methods too, that the notebooks prove nothing. It's the same playbook he used 22 years ago, and it worked then. They sat in silence for a long moment, both of them grappling with the weight of history repeating itself. Finally, Diane stood up. Wait here! She disappeared upstairs, and Deshawn heard her moving things around in her bedroom, opening closets, shifting boxes. When she came back down 10 minutes later, she was carrying a large cardboard box, the same kind of box that had held his father's notebooks. After James died, she said, setting it on the coffee table, I kept everything. His papers, his correspondence, his files from the university. I couldn't bear to throw it away, but I couldn't bear to look at it either. So I sealed it up and hid it. She opened the box, and Deshawn saw it was full of folders, envelopes, and bound documents. The paper had yellowed with age, but the writing was still clear. If you're going to fight Malcolm Weller, Diane said, you need to know everything, every detail, every piece of evidence your father tried to use. You need to learn from his mistakes. Deshaun reached into the box and pulled out the first folder. It was labeled Weller Correspondence 1999 to 2000 in his father's careful handwriting. As he began to read, as the full story of his father's destruction unfolded in letters and emails and formal complaints that went nowhere, Deshaun felt something crystallizing inside him. His father had fought alone, had trusted the system to be fair, to investigate honestly, to care about truth more than reputation. And the system had failed him. But Deshaun wasn't going to make the same mistake, because unlike his father, Deshaun had something powerful. He had proof not just of what his father had created, but of what Weller had done. He had the notebooks dated before Weller's publication. He had correspondence that showed the timeline. He had, buried in this box, evidence that had never been properly examined because no one had cared enough to look. And most importantly, he had the solution on the board in that lecture hall today, captured on at least 3 student phones, witnessed by 22 people. Undeniable proof that James Reed's methods were not only real, but revolutionary. Weller had made a mistake today, a fatal mistake. He'd made Deshaun visible. And now, with visibility came power. The power to rewrite history, the power to clear his father's name, the power to expose a theft that had been covered up for over 2 decades. "Mom," Deshaun said, looking up from the files, "do you know anyone who was in the mathematics department when Dad was there? Anyone who might have seen what really happened?" Diane thought for a moment. There was one professor, Dr. Renee Caldwell. She was just starting her career when James was a student. I remember your father saying she seemed troubled by what happened, like she wanted to say something but couldn't. Is she still at Ashford? I think so. I saw her name in the university newsletter last year. Deshaun pulled out his phone and searched the Ashford Mathematics Department website. There she was. Dr. Renee Caldwell, Associate Professor of Pure Mathematics. Her office hours were tomorrow afternoon. I need to make some copies of these files, Deshaun said, his mind already racing ahead, planning his next moves. And I need to organize Dad's notebooks chronologically, match them up with Weller's publication dates. Baby, are you sure about this? Diane's voice was frightened. Weller is powerful. He has the entire university behind him. If you go after him and fail, then I fail the same way Dad did, Deshaun interrupted gently. But if I don't fight, I've already failed, and his legacy dies with me. He looked at his mother, really looked at her, and saw the grief and fear and hope warring in her eyes. I'm not Dad, Deshaun said. I'm not going to fight this alone. I'm not going to trust that the system will be fair. I'm going to be strategic, careful, and I'm going to build a case so strong that Weller can't lie his way out of it. Diane reached across the table and took his hand. Your father would be proud of you, so proud. Then let's make sure his work finally gets the recognition it deserves. They spent the next 4 hours going through the box, organizing documents, creating a timeline, building the foundation of what would become Deshaun's case against Malcolm Weller. And as the evening sun faded outside the windows, as the evidence of his father's genius and Weller's betrayal spread across the coffee table, Deshaun felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years of calculated invisibility. He felt ready to be seen, not as a target, not as a victim, as the son of James Reed, brilliant mathematician, whose work was about to come back from the grave and drag the truth into the light. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after sleepless nights spent making decisions that can't be unmade. Deshaun had left his mother's house at midnight with 2 bags full of photocopied documents, his father's original notebooks carefully wrapped in plastic, and a determination that felt like steel in his chest. He'd spent the hours before dawn organizing everything in his apartment while his roommates slept, creating a timeline so detailed that every lie Weller had told could be traced back to a specific truth his father had written first. Now, standing outside Dr. Renee Caldwell's office at 2:47 p.m., Deshaun felt the weight of what he was about to do settle over him like a physical thing. This wasn't just about clearing his own name anymore. This was about resurrecting a ghost and forcing the living to answer for what they'd done to him. He knocked twice, firm but not aggressive. "Come in," called a voice from inside, warm and slightly distracted. Dr. Caldwell's office was smaller than Weller's, but infinitely more welcoming. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, mathematical journals stacked in precarious towers on the desk, and a worn leather chair faced a window that looked out over the campus green. The woman who turned to face him was in her early 50s, with natural hair pulled back in a loose bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. Her expression shifted from mild curiosity to sharp recognition when she saw him. "You're Deshaun Reed," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. I was hoping you had a few minutes to talk. I heard about what happened in Weller's class yesterday." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit, please. And you can drop the ma'am. It makes me feel about 90 years old." Deshaun sat, the bag with his father's documents heavy on his lap. Dr. Caldwell studied him with an intensity that felt different from Weller's predatory examination. This was the gaze of someone trying to solve a puzzle they actually cared about. "You look like him," she said finally. "Your father, James. You have his eyes." The words hit Deshaun like a physical blow. "You remember him?" "I remember him very well. I was a first-year professor when he was finishing his graduate work. 23 years ago now." She removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "I knew you'd come eventually. The moment I heard Malcolm had a student named Deshaun Reed in his advanced number theory class, I knew this day would arrive." "Why didn't you reach out to me?" "Because I'm a coward," Dr. Caldwell said bluntly. "I've been a coward for 23 years, and I'm hoping you're here to give me a chance to stop being one." The raw honesty of it left Deshaun momentarily speechless. He'd expected denial, deflection, the same institutional protection that had shielded Weller for over 2 decades. Instead, he was facing someone who looked like she'd been carrying the weight of her silence like chains. "Tell me what you know," Deshaun said, "about what Weller did to my father." Dr. Caldwell stood and moved to the window, her back to Deshaun, as if she couldn't face him while telling the truth. "Your father was extraordinary, not just brilliant. That word gets thrown around too easily in academia. James was transformative. He saw patterns and connections that the rest of us couldn't even imagine. Malcolm recognized it immediately, which is why he took James on as his graduate advisee. And then stole his work." "Yes." The word was barely above a whisper. "I watched it happen in real time. Malcolm started presenting James's methods in department meetings, claiming he'd developed them through his own research. When James confronted him privately, Malcolm told him that as his advisor, he had a right to collaborate on the work, that it was standard practice for advisors to be listed as co-authors or even primary authors on graduate student research. But that's not what happened. No. Malcolm didn't list James as a co-author. He published the seminal paper under his name alone, with a small acknowledgement buried in the footnotes thanking his graduate students for their assistance, as if James had just been handing him papers and making coffee. Deshaun felt anger rising in his throat, hot and acidic. "You saw this happening. Why didn't you do anything?" Dr. Caldwell turned back to face him, and there were tears in her eyes. "Because I was terrified. I was the only black woman in the department, barely holding on to my position, and Malcolm Weller was the department chair. If I'd spoken up, if I'd challenged him, he would have destroyed my career the same way he destroyed your father's. I told myself I'd wait until I had tenure, until I had protection, until I had power. But by the time I got those things, your father was already gone." She sat back down heavily, and Deshaun saw the guilt that had been eating at her for over 2 decades written in every line of her face. "I went to James's funeral," she continued. "Your mother wouldn't look at me. She knew I'd seen what happened and done nothing. I've had to live with that knowledge every single day since. Every time I pass Malcolm in the hallway, every time I sit in a department meeting and watch him receive honors for work that wasn't his, I remember the brilliant young man whose life he destroyed." "He's trying to do the same thing to me," Deshaun said quietly. "He's accusing me of academic dishonesty for using my father's methods he knows are legitimate because he stole them." Dr. Caldwell's expression hardened into something fierce. "Then we stop him. This time, we stop him." "How?" "He's got the entire university protecting him. He's been building his reputation on my father's work for 23 years. No one's going to believe that Malcolm Weller, celebrated mathematician, author of 17 books, holder of an endowed chair, is a fraud and a thief. They will if we have proof. Dr. Caldwell leaned forward. What do you have? Deshaun opened his bag and began pulling out documents. My father's notebooks, dated and time-stamped. His correspondence with Weller showing that he shared his methods with him as his advisor. Copies of his original dissertation drafts. And this, he placed a folder on her desk. The published paper where Weller used Method C, dated 6 months after my father was expelled. Dad never got to publish his own work because Weller had him removed from the university first. Dr. Caldwell opened the folder with shaking hands. She read silently for several minutes, her expression growing darker with each page. This is damning, she said finally, but it's 23 years old. Malcolm will argue that academic disputes from decades ago have no bearing on current proceedings. He'll say you're trying to deflect from your own potential misconduct by dredging up ancient history. It's not ancient history if the methods I used yesterday came directly from my father's notebooks. Methods that exist in documents dated before Weller's publication. Deshaun pulled out another folder. I have witness testimony from yesterday's class. 12 students have already emailed me saying they recorded the solution on their phones, that they saw me solve it in under 2 minutes with no notes, no technology, nothing but chalk, and my father's training. Malcolm will say you memorized it, that you somehow knew he'd ask that specific problem. How could I have known? He claimed it was an impossible equation that broke PhD candidates. Why would he have shared it with anyone in advance? He'll find a way to spin it, Dr. Caldwell said grimly. Malcolm is extraordinarily good at protecting himself. He's done it for 23 years. Then we need more than proof, Deshaun said, and there was steel in his voice now. We need someone from inside the department who was there, who saw what happened, who's willing to go on record and tell the truth. Dr. Caldwell was quiet for a long moment. There is someone, she said finally. Professor Richard Chen. He was a full professor when your father was a student, and he was on the review committee that handled James's plagiarism accusation. He's retired now, but he still lives in town. Will he talk to me? I don't know. Richard was always troubled by what happened. I could see it in his face during department meetings after your father's expulsion. But he voted to uphold Malcolm's accusation anyway. If he speaks out now, he's admitting he was complicit in destroying an innocent man's career. Then we make him understand that staying silent now means being complicit in destroying mine too. Deshaun started packing the documents back into his bag. Can you contact him? Set up a meeting? I can try. Dr. Caldwell pulled out her phone. But Deshaun, you need to understand something. Even if we get Richard to talk, even if we have all this proof, the university's first instinct will be to protect itself. They'll try to bury this, settle it quietly, make it disappear. They won't want the scandal of admitting that one of their most celebrated professors built his career on theft. Then we don't give them the option to bury it, Deshaun said. We make it too public to ignore. Dr. Caldwell looked at him with something like awe. Your father tried to fight quietly, through official channels, trusting the system to work. You're going to fight differently. I have to, because the system didn't work for him, and it won't work for me unless we force it to. Deshaun stood to leave. Let me know what Professor Chen says. Deshaun, Dr. Caldwell called as he reached the door. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry I didn't fight for your father when it mattered. Then fight for him now, Deshaun replied. Help me give him the justice he never got. He left her office feeling like he'd lit a fuse on something that couldn't be stopped. The question was whether it would explode in his face or in Weller's. 3 hours later, Deshaun received an email from Dr. Caldwell. Professor Richard Chen had agreed to meet with him the next day at a coffee shop near campus. The message was brief, professional, but Deshaun could read the anxiety between the lines. This was someone preparing to confess to a sin they'd been carrying for over 2 decades. That evening, Deshaun sat in his cramped apartment bedroom, surrounded by his father's notebooks and documents, and did something he hadn't done since he was 15 years old. He wrote a letter to a man he'd never really known. Dad, he wrote in a spiral notebook, his handwriting nowhere near as elegant as James Reed's had been. I don't know if you can hear this, wherever you are. I don't know if there's anything after death, if consciousness persists, if the brilliant mind that created Method C still exists in some form. But I need to tell you something. I understand now why you gave up, why the fight became too heavy, why being called a liar when you were telling the truth hurt more than you could bear, because I'm feeling it too. That rage at injustice, that helplessness against power, that knowledge that the system isn't designed to protect people like us. He paused, the pen hovering over the paper. But I'm not giving up. I'm going to finish what you started. I'm going to make them say your name, not as a cautionary tale, not as a footnote, but as the brilliant mathematician you were. And I'm going to make Malcolm Weller answer for what he did to you, I promise. He closed the notebook and placed it on top of his father's documents, as if sealing a pact with the dead. The next afternoon, Deshawn walked into the Grindhouse, a coffee shop frequented by Ashford faculty, and spotted Professor Richard Chen immediately. He was in his 70s, white-haired and distinguished in that way emeritus professors often were, sitting at a corner table with an untouched cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as Deshawn approached, and something in his expression, grief, guilt, resignation, told Deshawn that this meeting was going to be painful for both of them. Professor Chen? Deshawn extended his hand. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Sit down, young man. Chen's handshake was firm but trembling slightly. And call me Richard. I forfeited the right to professional courtesy a long time ago. Deshawn sat, studying the older man's face. There was no hostility there, no defensiveness, just the exhausted expression of someone who'd been waiting for judgment and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. Renee told me you're James Reed's son, Richard began without preamble. The moment she said your name, I knew. I've been expecting this conversation for 23 years. Then you know why I'm here. You want me to tell you what really happened when your father accused Malcolm Weller of theft. Richard finally picked up his coffee, his hands shaking enough that some sloshed over the rim. You want me to admit that we railroaded an innocent man, destroyed his career, and drove him to suicide because it was easier than holding a powerful colleague accountable. The bluntness of it stole Deshawn's breath. Yes. Then I'll tell you. Richard set down the coffee cup carefully. But I warn you, knowing the truth and proving it to people who don't want to hear it are two very different things. I'm listening. Richard took a deep breath. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-suppressed confession. Your father came to the review committee with evidence, notebooks full of original work, dated entries, correspondence with Malcolm that clearly showed the progression of ideas. He presented a timeline that proved conclusively his methods existed before Malcolm's publication. Any reasonable person looking at that evidence would have seen that James Reed was telling the truth. But the committee didn't believe him. The committee didn't want to believe him, Richard corrected. Malcolm was the department chair. He'd brought in millions in grant money. He had relationships with every major mathematics journal and publisher. Admitting he was a thief would have destroyed the department's reputation, jeopardized our funding, and turned us into a scandal instead of a respected institution. So you protected the department instead of protecting my father? Yes. The word came out like a wound being lanced. Malcolm presented his own counter-evidence, emails that he'd doctored to make it look like James had been struggling, asking for help, borrowing ideas. He had two other faculty members testify that they'd seen James's work was derivative, and he played the card that, 23 years ago, was almost impossible to overcome. What card? Richard met Deshawn's eyes. He suggested your father was unstable, paranoid, experiencing some kind of mental health crisis that made him believe conspiracy theories about his advisor. He painted James as a troubled young man who couldn't accept that his work wasn't as original as he thought, who was looking for someone to blame for his own shortcomings. Deshawn felt rage flooding through him, hot and blinding. And you all believed that? We wanted to believe it, Richard said, and there were tears on his face now. Because believing it meant we didn't have to do the hard thing. We didn't have to investigate our department chair, challenge a powerful colleague, or admit that our institution had protected a thief. So we voted to uphold Malcolm's accusation. We expelled your father, and we told ourselves we'd done the right thing. You killed him, Deshawn said, his voice shaking. Maybe not directly, but you put the weapon in his hand when you took away his future and called him a liar. I know. Richard wiped his face roughly. I've known it every day for 23 years. I retired early because I couldn't stand to walk those halls anymore. Couldn't stand to see Malcolm receiving awards for work that belonged to your father. Couldn't stand my own reflection in the mirror. Why didn't you speak up afterward? Why didn't you come forward when he died? Because I'm a coward, Richard said simply, and because I told myself it was too late, that speaking up wouldn't bring James back, that destroying my own reputation wouldn't serve any purpose. I've spent 2 decades making excuses for my silence. Deshaun pulled out his father's notebooks and placed them on the table between them. Then stop making excuses. Help me. Richard looked at the notebooks like they were holy relics. With trembling hands, he opened one and began reading. His expression shifted from grief to wonder to rage as he turned pages, seeing the brilliance that had been stolen, the ideas that had been claimed by another man, the genius that had been buried under lies. Method C, he whispered, his finger tracing the equations. This is where it started. James showed me this method when he was developing it. I remember telling him it was revolutionary. And 6 months later, Malcolm published it as his own discovery. Will you testify to that? Deshaun asked. Will you go on record? Richard closed the notebook carefully. If I testify, I'm admitting I knowingly participated in a fraud. I'm destroying whatever reputation I have left. I'm opening myself up to legal consequences. Yes. And Malcolm will fight back with everything he has. He'll call me senile, bitter, unreliable. He'll say I'm lying to protect you because I feel guilty about your father. Probably. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at the notebooks, at the evidence of the crime he'd helped conceal. Finally, he looked up at Deshaun, and something in his expression had shifted from guilt to determination. Your father deserves better than my cowardice, he said. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything, what I saw, what I knew, what we did. And if it costs me everything I have left, so be it. It's a debt that's 23 years overdue. Deshaun felt something in his chest release, like a breath he'd been holding for his entire life. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Richard warned. This is going to get ugly. Malcolm won't go down without a fight, and the university will do everything in its power to protect itself. Let them try. Deshaun gathered the notebooks. Because this time, we're not fighting alone, and this time, we have something my father didn't. What's that? Witnesses, documentation, and most importantly, Deshaun pulled out his phone and showed Richard the video one of his classmates had sent him, footage of him solving the impossible equation in 94 seconds. Proof that James Reed's methods weren't just real, they were revolutionary enough that his son could replicate them 23 years later without any formal training. Richard watched the video with tears streaming down his face. He lives in you, he said quietly. All that brilliance, all that genius. James lives in you. Then let's make sure his name lives too. They spent the next 2 hours going through documents, with Richard providing context and confirmation for everything Deshaun had found. The retired professor's testimony would be crucial. He could authenticate the timeline, confirm Malcolm's theft, and most importantly, admit that the review committee had knowingly protected a fraud. When they finally left the coffee shop, darkness had fallen over campus. Richard shook Deshaun's hand one more time, holding it firmly. Your father would be proud of you, he said. Not just for fighting, but for fighting smart. For building a case instead of just making accusations. For refusing to be destroyed the way he was. Will you write it down? Deshaun asked. Everything you told me today. A sworn statement that can be submitted with my formal complaint. I'll have it for you by tomorrow morning. Richard paused. Malcolm is going to know I'm involved. He'll come after me. Let him. Because once your statement is on record, once Dr. Caldwell adds her testimony, once we submit my father's notebooks and the video evidence, Malcolm Weller won't be able to lie his way out of this. Deshaun walked back to his apartment feeling like he'd just assembled the pieces of a weapon his father had forged 2 decades ago. Now he just had to decide when and how to use it. The answer came sooner than he expected. 2 days later, Deshaun received an email from the Academic Integrity Board requesting his presence at a preliminary hearing scheduled for the following Monday. The email was coldly formal, outlining the charges against him. Unauthorized use of external materials and misrepresentation of work as original, and informing him that failure to appear would result in automatic expulsion. He called Dr. Caldwell immediately. They're moving fast, she said, her voice tight with tension. Faster than normal. Malcolm must be pushing them to resolve this before you can build a proper defense. Then we move faster. Deshaun was pacing his apartment, his mind racing through options. Can you attend the hearing as my faculty advocate? Yes, and I've already reached out to the board chair explaining that there are significant extenuating circumstances they need to hear. What about Richard's statement? He sent it to me this morning, 20 pages, Deshaun, detailed, damning, and sworn under oath. He's not holding anything back. And my father's notebooks? We'll bring everything, but you need to prepare yourself. Even with all this evidence, the board might try to separate your case from your father's. They might say that Malcolm's potential academic misconduct 23 years ago doesn't prove your innocence now. Then we make them see that it's the same case, Deshaun said firmly. That Malcolm is trying to destroy me for the same reason he destroyed my father, because I have evidence of his crime and the talent to prove it. The hearing was held in the Ashford Administration Building, in a conference room that felt designed for intimidation. Dark wood paneling, an imposing table, and 7 board members sitting in judgment, 4 faculty, 2 administrators, and 1 student representative who looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. Deshaun sat on one side of the table with Dr. Caldwell beside him, his father's notebooks and documents arranged in neat stacks in front of them. On the other side sat Professor Malcolm Weller with the university's legal counsel, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Morrison, who specialized in protecting Ashford from scandals. The board chair, Dean Catherine Ellis, called the hearing to order at exactly 3 p.m. We're here today to address charges of academic dishonesty against Mr. Deshaun Reed, a sophomore in the mathematics program. Professor Weller, please present your concerns. Weller stood, and Deshaun noticed his hands were steady, his expression carefully neutral. This was a man who'd spent 23 years perfecting the art of credible lies. Thank you, Dean Ellis. On September 23rd, I presented my advanced number theory class with a problem that has historically been unsolvable by graduate students. I offered Mr. Reed the opportunity to attempt it, and he produced a solution in approximately 90 seconds. And this concerns you because, Dean Ellis prompted, because the method he used is highly specialized, not taught in any undergraduate curriculum, and frankly beyond the capabilities of most PhD candidates. When I questioned Mr. Reed about where he learned this method, he claimed his deceased father taught him, a father who, according to my research, had no published work and was expelled from graduate school for academic dishonesty. The implication hung in the air like poison, like father, like son. Dr. Caldwell stood abruptly. Dean Ellis, I must object to Professor Weller's characterization of James Reed. Dr. Caldwell, you'll have your opportunity to speak, Dean Ellis interrupted. Professor Weller, continue. I believe Mr. Reed had prior access to this specific problem, or to solutions developed by others. The speed and accuracy of his response suggests memorization rather than genuine mathematical insight. I'm requesting a thorough investigation, and pending that investigation, Mr. Reed's suspension from my course. He sat down, and Patricia Morrison immediately leaned over to whisper something in his ear. Weller nodded, his expression confident. Dean Ellis turned to Deshaun. Mr. Reed, how do you respond to these charges? Deshaun stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on him. This was the moment his father had faced 23 years ago, standing accused by the man who'd stolen from him, drowning in a system designed to protect power instead of truth. But Deshaun wasn't his father, and this time the story was going to end differently. I'd like to submit evidence, Deshaun said calmly. With the board's permission. Dean Ellis nodded. Proceed. Deshaun placed his father's notebook on the table, the one with the coffee stain, the one that contained Method C. This notebook belonged to my father, James Reed. It's dated 1998 to 2002, covering his graduate work at Ashford University. In it, you'll find the development of the method Professor Weller claims I couldn't have learned legitimately. He opened to the marked page and turned the notebook so the board members could see. Here, Method C, fully developed, with a note that reads, Solved. Method C. Weller said it was impossible, proved him wrong. He didn't like that. Weller's face had gone pale. That notebook could have been created recently. There's no way to authenticate. Actually, there is, Dr. Caldwell interjected, standing beside Deshaun. We've had the ink and paper analyzed by the university's own forensics lab. The report confirms the pages were written between 1999 and 2002. The notebook is authentic. She placed the forensics report on the table. Dean Ellis picked it up, scanning it quickly, her expression growing troubled. Furthermore, Deshawn continued, pulling out Richard Chen's statement, I have sworn testimony from Professor Richard Chen, who served on the review committee that handled my father's accusation against Professor Weller 23 years ago. In his statement, Professor Chen admits that the committee knew my father's work was original, that they saw evidence of Professor Weller's theft, and that they protected Professor Weller anyway to avoid scandal. The room erupted. Weller shot to his feet. This is absurd. Ancient accusations from a disgruntled... It's not ancient if the stolen work is being used to accuse me of cheating right now, Deshawn said loudly, cutting through Weller's protest. Professor Weller is trying to destroy me for the same reason he destroyed my father, because I have proof that the work he built his career on wasn't his, because every time I demonstrate James Reed's methods, I expose the theft he's been covering up for 23 years. Mr. Reed, that's a serious accusation, Dean Ellis began. It's the truth, Dr. Caldwell said firmly, and I can corroborate it. I was a first-year professor when James Reed was expelled. I witnessed Professor Weller presenting methods in department meetings that I knew came from James Reed's work. I stayed silent out of fear for my own career, and I've regretted it every day since. But I won't stay silent anymore. The board members were looking at each other now, confused, concerned, clearly unprepared for the hearing to explode into something far bigger than simple academic dishonesty. Patricia Morrison was whispering urgently to Weller, whose face had shifted from pale to furious red. This is a witch hunt, Weller declared. An attempt to deflect from Mr. Reed's own misconduct by dredging up false accusations from decades ago. I demand... You don't get to demand anything, Deshawn said, and his voice carried his father's rage, his father's pain, his father's unfinished fight. You stole my father's life's work. You destroyed his career when he tried to expose you. You drove him to suicide by calling him a liar and a thief when he was neither. And now you're trying to do the same thing to me because I'm proof that James Reed's brilliance was real. So real, it could be passed down to his son. So revolutionary that 23 years later, it can still solve problems you claim are impossible. The silence that followed was absolute. Dean Ellis set down her papers with trembling hands. We're going to need to recess. This hearing has raised issues far beyond its original scope. No, Deshawn said firmly. We're not recessing so you can find a way to bury this quietly. We're finishing this right now. Either you investigate Professor Weller's theft of my father's work and clear my name, or I'm taking every piece of evidence I have. The notebooks, the testimonies, the video of me solving that equation, all of it, to every media outlet that will listen. I'll make sure the entire world knows that Ashford University protected an academic thief for 23 years and tried to destroy his son when he came back to expose the truth. The threat hung in the air. Patricia Morrison looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Dean Ellis closed her eyes briefly, and Deshawn could see her calculating the scandal, the liability, the public relations nightmare. This hearing is suspended pending a full investigation, she said finally. Mr. Reed, your charges are dropped immediately. Professor Weller, you are suspended from teaching duties until this matter is resolved. This board will conduct an independent review of the accusations involving James Reed's work. Catherine, this is outrageous, Weller started. The decision is made, Malcolm. Dean Ellis's voice was ice. And given the seriousness of these allegations, you should consult with your own legal counsel. Weller stared at her, at the board, at Deshawn, with an expression of pure hatred. Then he grabbed his briefcase and stormed out of the room, Patricia Morrison hurrying after him. The board members filed out quickly, leaving Deshawn and Dr. Caldwell alone in this conference room. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Dr. Caldwell laughed, a sound of disbelief and relief and triumph all mixed together. You just took down Malcolm Weller, she said. Do you understand what you just did? Deshawn sank into his chair, adrenaline finally fading into exhaustion. I kept a promise. To your father? To both of us. Dr. Caldwell placed a hand on his shoulder. This isn't over. Malcolm will fight back. The university will try to contain it. You're You're going to face pressure from people who want you to settle quietly, to accept compensation and an apology behind closed doors. I'm not settling, Deshawn said quietly. Not until my father's name is cleared completely. Not until Weller's theft is publicly acknowledged. Not until every paper he published using my father's methods is corrected. Then you're in for a long fight. Good, Deshawn replied, looking at his father's notebook still lying on the table. Because I have nothing but time, and I'm fighting for someone who doesn't have any time left. The university moved with the kind of deliberate slowness that institutions perfect when they're trying to manage catastrophes. 3 days after the hearing, Deshawn received a formal letter informing him that an independent review panel was being assembled to investigate the allegations against Professor Weller. The letter was carefully worded, filled with phrases like due process and maintaining academic integrity and protecting all parties involved, which Deshawn recognized as legal cover for an organization preparing to discover that one of its most celebrated faculty members had built his entire career on stolen work. What the letter didn't say, but what Deshawn learned from Dr. Caldwell, was that Malcolm Weller had hired 3 different law firms and was threatening to sue the university, the review board, and Deshawn personally for defamation. The professor was fighting back with everything he had, just as Richard Chen had predicted, and he was doing it with the resources of someone who'd accumulated wealth and power over 2 decades of fraudulent success. Deshawn sat in Dr. Caldwell's office on a gray October morning, rain streaking the windows, listening to her outline the battle ahead. Weller's attorneys are arguing that the review panel constitutes a conflict of interest because you're a current student and he's faculty, she explained, her fingers drumming anxiously on her desk. They're pushing for an external arbitrator, someone from outside Ashford, which could take months to arrange. He's trying to drag this out, Deshawn said, hoping I'll graduate or give up or run out of money for my own legal defense. That's exactly what he's doing, and it might work, Deshawn. Fighting this properly, really fighting it, could cost you tens of thousands in legal fees. The university won't provide you with counsel, because technically, you're not a defendant anymore. You're a witness in a much larger investigation. Deshawn thought about his bank account, which had maybe $800 in it on a good day. Thought about his mother, who was already working double shifts to help with his tuition. Thought about his father, who'd fought alone until the weight of it crushed him. What if we don't let it go to arbitration? He asked. What if we make this so public that dragging it out becomes impossible? Dr. Caldwell looked at him carefully. You mean go to the media? I mean go everywhere. Student newspaper, local news, mathematics journals, social media. Make this story too big to contain. Force the university to act quickly because staying silent becomes more damaging than admitting the truth. That's risky. You'd be painting a target on yourself. Weller's supporters, and he has many, would come after you. You'd be accused of seeking attention, of being opportunistic, of exploiting your father's tragedy for personal gain. Let them. Deshawn's voice was firm. Because every accusation they make will just give me another chance to show the evidence. Every attack will bring more attention to what Weller did. And unlike my father, I'm not fighting this alone in the shadows. I have you. I have Richard Chen's testimony. I have video evidence and notebooks and a timeline that proves everything. Dr. Caldwell was quiet for a moment, studying him with an expression that mixed concern with something like pride. Your father would have hated this approach. James believed in the system, in following proper channels, in letting the evidence speak for itself. And the system destroyed him, Deshawn replied quietly. I love my father, but I'm not going to make his mistakes. If the system won't give us justice, we'll create enough pressure that it has no choice. All right. Dr. Caldwell pulled out her laptop. Then let's start with the student newspaper. I know the editor. She's sharp, fair, and she's been looking for a story that matters. After that, we reach out to Professor Margaret Foster at MIT. She's written extensively about academic fraud and has a platform that reaches the entire mathematical community. If she picks this up, every mathematician in the country will hear about it. They spent the next 2 hours crafting their strategy, but they were interrupted by a knock on Dr. Caldwell's door. She called for whoever it was to enter, and a young black woman stepped in, her expression a mix of determination and nervousness. Dr. Caldwell? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I heard through the department grapevine that you might be in here with Deshawn Reed, and I really need to talk to both of you. And you are? Dr. Caldwell asked, not unkindly. Jasmine Tucker. I'm a PhD candidate in the math department. Professor Weller was my dissertation advisor. She glanced at Deshawn. Until 3 days ago, when he was suspended. Deshawn felt his pulse quicken. Come in. Close the door. Jasmine did, then stood there for a moment as if gathering courage. She was maybe 26 or 27, dressed in jeans and an Ashford hoodie, with exhaustion written in the dark circles under her eyes. I've been trying to decide if I should come forward, she said finally, trying to figure out if it would help or just make everything worse. But then I read Professor Chen's statement. It's circulating through the department, and I realized I can't stay silent anymore. What do you need to tell us? Dr. Caldwell asked gently. Jasmine pulled a flash drive from her pocket. I have emails, correspondence between me and Professor Weller from the past 3 years. I didn't understand what I was looking at until I heard about James Reed and what Weller did to him. But now I see the pattern. She handed the flash drive to Dr. Caldwell. Weller has been taking my work, not all of it, but key pieces, methods I developed, proofs I worked out, insights I shared with him as my advisor. And then I see those exact same ideas showing up in papers he publishes, sometimes just weeks later, with no attribution to me. Just a generic acknowledgement of his research group in the footnotes. Deshawn and Dr. Caldwell exchanged glances. This was the pattern repeating itself, exactly as they'd suspected. How much work are we talking about? Deshawn asked. 3 papers over the past 2 years, all published in major journals, all using methods I developed and shared with him in our advisory meetings. Jasmine's voice was shaking now, anger breaking through the professional facade. I thought I was going crazy, thought maybe this was normal, that advisors always used their students' work like this. But when I tried to publish my own paper using those same methods, Weller told me I couldn't because he'd already established priority on them. He stole your dissertation before you could even finish it, Dr. Caldwell said, her voice hard. And when I confronted him about it privately, he told me I was being paranoid, that I should be grateful my work was contributing to significant publications even if my name wasn't on them, that this was how academic mentorship worked. Jasmine wiped her eyes roughly. I've been scared to say anything because he controls my entire future. He writes my recommendations, sits on my committee, determines whether I get my PhD. Speaking out means risking everything. Not anymore, Deshawn said. Not if we're all speaking out together. Jasmine looked at him, and something in her expression cracked. Relief and fear and exhausted hope all mixed together. You really think we can stop him? I know we can, because he's been using the same playbook for over 20 years, and it only works when his victims fight alone and in silence. But we're not doing that. Deshawn gestured to the flash drive. Your emails, my father's notebooks, Professor Chen's testimony, that's not just one accusation anymore. That's a pattern of theft spanning decades. That's impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding or coincidence. Dr. Caldwell was already plugging the flash drive into her computer, scanning through files. Her expression grew darker with each email she opened. This is damning, she said finally. Jasmine, you're right. This is systematic theft, and the timestamps prove everything. You sent him these methods months before his publications. She turned to Jasmine. Are there other students, other advisees who might have experienced the same thing? Maybe. Probably. Jasmine sat down heavily. Weller's had dozens of graduate students over the years. Not all of them finished. Some just disappeared from the program, and I never knew why. I thought they couldn't handle the pressure, but now I wonder if they discovered what he was doing and left rather than fight. Then we find them, Deshawn said. We track down every student Weller advised, and we ask if he took their work. Because if there are more victims, we need their voices. Over the next week, that's exactly what they did. Dr. Caldwell used her departmental access to pull records of Weller's former advisees from the past 15 years. They found 17 names, 8 who'd completed their PhDs, and 9 who'd left the program without finishing. Deshawn and Jasmine began reaching out to them, carefully explaining what they were investigating and asking if anyone had similar experiences. The responses came slowly at first, then faster as word spread. 4 former students agreed to speak on the record. 3 others wanted to remain anonymous but provided documentation of their interactions with Weller. And one, a man named David Chen, who'd left the program 6 years earlier, sent back an email that was just 2 sentences. Malcolm Weller destroyed my career. Tell me how I can help destroy his. They met with David in a crowded diner off campus, and he brought a cardboard box full of his own evidence, emails, annotated drafts, and a side-by-side comparison of his dissertation chapter and a paper Weller published 3 months later that was nearly identical. I left because I couldn't prove it, David told them, his voice bitter with old anger. I knew he'd stolen my work, but I was just a grad student and he was Malcolm Weller. Who was going to believe me? So I walked away, got a job in industry, and tried to forget about mathematics entirely. We can prove it now, Deshawn said. We have enough victims, enough evidence, enough documentation that Weller can't dismiss this as isolated incidents. David looked at Deshawn's father's notebooks, which were spread across the table between them, and something in his expression shifted from anger to something like awe. Your father developed Method C? The entire foundation of Weller's reputation? Yes. Then this goes deeper than theft, David said slowly. This means every honor Weller's received, every position he's held, every book he's published, all of it is built on fraud. This isn't just about academic dishonesty. This is about a man who's been posing as a brilliant mathematician for 2 decades when he's actually just a sophisticated plagiarist. That night, Deshawn sat in his apartment with his laptop open, writing an email to Professor Margaret Foster at MIT. He outlined everything: his father's story, the pattern of theft, the testimonies from multiple victims, the documentary evidence that spanned decades. He attached scans of key pages from his father's notebooks, copies of Richard Chen's sworn statement, and a link to the video of him solving the equation. Before he hit send, he called his mother. "This is going to get bad, Mom," he told her. "Once this story goes public, Weller's going to come after us with everything he has. There might be lawsuits, media attention, people digging into Dad's life and death. Are you ready for that?" Diane was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "Your father spent 2 years trying to clear his name, and no one would listen. If you can make them listen now, if you can give him the justice he deserved, then I don't care how bad it gets. Do what you need to do, baby. Finish this." Deshawn hit send. Professor Foster responded within 6 hours. She called him directly, her voice sharp with the urgency of someone who'd spent 30 years investigating academic fraud and knew a major story when she saw one. "Mr. Reed, I've read your email 3 times and reviewed all your attachments. If even half of what you're alleging is true, Malcolm Weller has committed what may be the most extensive academic fraud in modern mathematics. I want to publish your story, but I need to verify everything first. Can you come to MIT? Bring the original notebooks, all your documentation. I'll assemble a panel of experts to authenticate the work." "When?" "This weekend. I'm clearing my schedule. This is too important to wait." Deshawn made the trip to Boston on a Greyhound bus, the precious notebooks packed carefully in a waterproof bag. His entire case reduced to 15 pounds of paper and ink. Dr. Caldwell had wanted to come with him, but she was needed at Ashford to manage the growing crisis. Jasmine Tucker had gone on record with the student newspaper, and her story, professor accused of systematic theft from graduate students, had exploded across campus. Students were protesting, faculty were demanding answers, and the university administration was scrambling to contain a scandal that was metastasizing by the hour. At MIT, Professor Foster met him in her office, a space that made Dr. Caldwell's book-filled room look minimalist by comparison. Every surface was covered with papers, journals, and what looked like 30 years of collected evidence about academic misconduct cases. "Let me see them," Foster said without preamble, and Deshawn carefully laid out his father's notebooks on her desk. She examined them with the kind of intense focus Deshawn recognized from his own mathematical work, her fingers tracing equations, her lips moving silently as she verified proofs. She spent 2 hours on the first notebook alone, occasionally making notes or pulling out published papers to compare. "This is remarkable," she said finally. "Your father wasn't just brilliant, he was visionary. Some of these methods are still cutting edge today. And you're saying Weller published all of this under his own name?" "Not all of it, just the revolutionary parts. The work that made him famous." Foster pulled up Weller's publication record on her computer. His breakthrough paper, the one that established him as a leading figure in number theory, was published in 2001, 6 months after your father was expelled. And 2 months after my father filed his formal complaint, which the university buried. Do you have documentation of that complaint? Deshawn handed her a folder. The original filing, the university's dismissal letter, and emails from my father to the review board that were never answered. Foster read through everything, her expression growing harder with each page. When she finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at Deshawn with something close to fury. 23 years, she said. For 23 years, Malcolm Weller has been celebrated, awarded, promoted, and enriched for work he stole from a graduate student he destroyed. And the institution that should have protected your father instead protected his abuser. Can you help me prove it? I can do better than that. I can make sure every mathematician in the world knows about it. Foster stood and began pacing. I'm going to write this up for the Journal of Mathematical Ethics. I'm going to present the evidence to the American Mathematical Society. And I'm going to personally call every major mathematics department in the country and make sure they understand what Weller did. He'll sue you for defamation. Let him try. I've been documenting academic fraud for 3 decades, and I've never lost a case because I only publish what I can prove beyond any doubt. And this? She gestured at the spread of evidence on her desk. This is the most well-documented case of academic theft I've ever seen. Weller's attorneys will take one look at your father's notebooks and the corroborating testimony, and they'll advise him to settle quietly. But Malcolm Weller didn't settle quietly. Instead, he went on the offensive. 2 days after Deshawn returned from MIT, Weller held a press conference at a downtown hotel, flanked by his attorneys and a handful of supporters from the mathematics community. He stood at a podium with the confidence of a man who'd spent decades being believed without question, and he delivered a performance that was part wounded innocence, part righteous indignation. I stand before you today as a victim of a coordinated campaign of defamation orchestrated by individuals with personal vendettas against me and against Ashford University, Weller announced to the assembled reporters. The accusations being leveled against me are false, malicious, and designed to destroy a lifetime of legitimate scholarship. Deshawn watched the press conference on his laptop in Dr. Caldwell's office, his jaw clenched with anger. He's not even denying it specifically, Dr. Caldwell observed. He's just calling it defamation without addressing any of the actual evidence. That's the strategy, Jasmine said from her position by the window. She'd been spending most of her time in Dr. Caldwell's office since going public, afraid to be alone, afraid of running into Weller's supporters. Make it about character attacks instead of evidence. Make people question our motives instead of examining our proof. On screen, Weller continued. James Reed was a troubled young man who experienced mental health challenges that affected his work and his judgment. I tried to help him as his advisor, but ultimately, he couldn't accept that his work was not at the level required for publication. His subsequent accusations were born of that disappointment, and now, tragically, his son is perpetuating those same false claims. He's calling my father crazy, Deshawn said, his voice shaking with rage, just like he did 23 years ago. And it worked then because no one challenged it, Dr. Caldwell replied. But we're challenging it now, with evidence, with testimony, with multiple victims who can't all be dismissed as mentally ill or vindictive. A reporter raised her hand. Professor Weller, what about the evidence Mr. Reed has presented? The notebooks dated before your publications? The testimony from Professor Chen, the pattern of similar accusations from your other students? Weller's expression remained calm, practiced. I've reviewed the supposed evidence, and I can tell you that notebooks can be created at any time and backdated. Professor Chen is a retired colleague who has his own grievances with the university. And as for my current and former students, academia is full of ambitious individuals who sometimes become resentful when their work doesn't meet publication standards. But you haven't provided any counter-evidence, another reporter pressed. You haven't explained how Mr. Reed could solve your impossible equation in 90 seconds if he didn't have legitimate training in these methods. I'm not required to prove my innocence, Weller shot back, and there was an edge to his voice now. The burden of proof lies with my accusers, and they have provided nothing but circumstantial evidence and conspiracy theories. The press conference went on for another 20 minutes. with Weller deflecting every hard question and his attorneys threatening legal action against anyone who published what they called unsubstantiated allegations. By the time it ended, Deshawn felt exhausted and furious in equal measure. "He's good at this," he admitted. "He's making it sound like we're the villains." "He's had 23 years of practice," Dr. Caldwell said, "but he made a mistake today." "What mistake?" "He didn't explain the mathematics." She rewound the press conference to a moment when a reporter had asked Weller to explain Method C. "Watch. He deflects, says it's too technical for a general audience. But any mathematician watching this will notice that he couldn't or wouldn't explain the very method that made him famous. You think people will catch that?" "I think Professor Foster will make sure they catch it." Dr. Caldwell pulled up her email. "Look, she's already written a response and distributed it to every major mathematics department in North America. She's asking for independent verification of your father's notebooks and challenging Weller to publicly solve a problem using Method C without preparation, the same way you did." Deshawn read the email, and a smile slowly spread across his face. "She's calling him out." "She's doing more than that. She's putting his reputation on the line. If Weller can't demonstrate mastery of the methods he claims to have developed, it proves he doesn't actually understand them, that he's been using stolen work he never truly comprehended." The challenge went viral in mathematics circles. Within days, prominent mathematicians from around the world were weighing in, some defending Weller out of loyalty or professional courtesy, but others pointing out the suspicious gaps in his explanations, the way he'd always been better at presenting ideas than developing them. The curious fact that his most innovative work had all come early in his career and had gradually become more derivative over the years. And then the dam broke completely. A former colleague of Weller's from 20 years earlier, a professor named Helena Rodriguez, who'd since moved to a university in Spain, published an open letter describing her own experience with Weller. She detailed how he'd pressured her to share preliminary findings from her research, then published those findings under his own name before she could. She'd stayed silent because she'd been untenured and vulnerable, but seeing the pattern of accusations gave her the courage to finally speak. Her letter opened the floodgates. More victims came forward, each with their own story of how Malcolm Weller had stolen their work, their ideas, their careers. Some were graduate students he'd advised. Others were colleagues he'd collaborated with. A few were mathematicians who'd shared early-stage research with him at conferences, only to see their ideas published under Weller's name months later. The stories were remarkably consistent. Weller would gain access to innovative work, use his position and reputation to publish it first, then either discredit the original researcher or bury their attempts to claim credit. He'd built an empire on theft, and he'd sustained it through intimidation, manipulation, and the institutional protection that came with success. Deshawn watched it all unfold with a sense of vindication mixed with grief. His father had been just one victim among many, but his father had been the first, the one Weller had learned on, the one whose destruction had taught the professor how to perfect his predatory system. "We need to keep the pressure on," Deshawn told Dr. Caldwell and Jasmine during one of their strategy sessions. "Weller's trying to wait this out, hoping the story dies down and people forget. We can't let that happen." "What do you suggest?" Jasmine asked. "We go back to the university. We demand that the review panel accelerate their investigation and make their findings public. We force Ashford to choose between protecting Weller and protecting what's left of their institutional credibility." Dr. Caldwell shook her head slowly. "The university is going to resist that. They want to investigate quietly, settle this behind closed doors, maybe offer you and the other victims some kind of compensation in exchange for non-disclosure agreements. Then we make it clear that we're not interested in settlements. We're interested in truth, public truth. Official acknowledgement that Malcolm Weller is a fraud and that everyone he hurt, especially my father, deserves to have their names cleared and their work recognized." "That's a hard line to take," Dr. Caldwell warned. "The university has resources you don't. They can drag this out for years, bury you in legal motions, make your life miserable." "They can try," Deshawn replied. "But I have something they don't. I have the truth, and I have people who are finally ready to hear it. 23 years ago, my father fought alone against an institution that wanted him to disappear. But I'm not alone. I have you, Professor Chen, Jasmine, David, Professor Foster, and every other person Weller hurt who's finally ready to speak up. That's not something they can bury." The determination in his voice left no room for argument. Dr. Caldwell and Jasmine exchanged glances, then nodded. "All right," Dr. Caldwell said. "Then let's finish this." They drafted a formal demand letter to the university president, signed by Deshawn, the 7 other victims who'd come forward, and 17 faculty members, including Richard Chen and Renee Caldwell. The letter laid out the evidence against Weller in painstaking detail and demanded an expedited investigation with public findings. It gave the university 2 weeks to respond. The letter leaked to the press within hours of being submitted. Deshawn suspected that Dr. Caldwell had made sure of that, and suddenly the story was national news. Major newspapers picked it up, television news programs covered it, and social media exploded with debates about academic integrity, power dynamics in universities, and the need for systemic reform. Malcolm Weller's world was crumbling, and he knew it. But cornered predators are the most dangerous, and Weller had one card left to play. 3 days before the university's deadline to respond, Deshawn received a letter from Weller's attorneys. It was delivered to his apartment by courier, thick and official and terrifying in its implications. Inside was a lawsuit, not for defamation, as everyone had expected, but for something more insidious. Weller was suing Deshawn for unlawful possession of proprietary intellectual property, claiming that James Reed's notebooks contained work developed under Weller's supervision as part of the advisor-student relationship and therefore belonged to Weller, not to Deshawn. He was trying to take the notebooks, the only physical proof of his father's genius, the evidence that proved everything. Deshawn's hand shook as he read the legal language, and for the first time since this fight began, he felt genuine fear. If Weller won this lawsuit, if a judge ruled that the notebooks were university property, or that they'd been created under Weller's guidance and therefore belonged to him, Deshawn would lose the foundation of his entire case. He called Dr. Caldwell immediately, then Professor Foster, then his mother. They convened an emergency meeting that night, and Deshawn brought the lawsuit with him, his father's notebooks locked safely in his apartment, suddenly feeling vulnerable in a way they never had before. "This is a desperate move," Professor Foster said after reading the filing. "Weller knows he's losing, so he's trying to suppress the evidence entirely." "Can he do that?" Deshawn asked. "Can he actually take my father's notebooks?" "He can try," Foster replied. "But his legal theory is absurd. Those notebooks were James's personal property, created independently, and they passed to you as his heir. Weller has no legitimate claim to them." "Then why is he doing this?" "Because even a frivolous lawsuit can achieve his goal," Dr. Caldwell explained grimly. "While this case is pending, the notebooks might be tied up as evidence. You might not be able to use them publicly. It could delay the university's investigation, muddy the waters, and give Weller time to mount a more effective defense." "Or," Jasmine added quietly, "he's hoping you can't afford to fight a legal battle and you'll surrender the notebooks rather than go bankrupt defending your right to them." Deshawn felt the trap closing around him, felt the system working exactly the way it had worked on his father, using complexity and expense and time as weapons against someone who just wanted the truth to be acknowledged. But he also felt something else rising inside him, something that had been building since that first day in Weller's classroom when he'd been called to the board like a sacrifice. It was the accumulated rage of 23 years, the fury of a child who'd grown up without a father because a system had chosen reputation over justice, and it burned with a clarity that cut through his fear. "Let him sue," Deshawn said, and his voice was steady now. "Let him try to take the notebooks, because every legal filing, every motion, every action he takes just gives us more opportunities to put the evidence on the public record. Court proceedings are public. Legal documents can be reported on. If Weller wants to fight about who owns my father's work, we'll have that fight in open court where every mathematician in the world can watch him try to claim ownership of genius he never possessed." Professor Foster smiled slowly. "You're learning to use the system against itself." "I learned from my father's mistakes," Deshawn replied. "He trusted the system to be fair. I know it's not fair. But I also know how to make it transparent. And transparency is what Weller fears most. Over the next week, they prepared their response to the lawsuit while simultaneously pushing the university toward action. Deshawn gave interviews to anyone who'd listen, always making sure to mention the evidence, always pointing people toward the facts, always turning the conversation back to the pattern of theft that Weller couldn't explain away. And slowly, steadily, the pressure became unbearable for everyone trying to protect Malcolm Weller. Faculty members began distancing themselves from him. Students demanded his name be removed from the building where the mathematics department was housed. Other universities quietly rescinded invitations for him to speak or visit. His publishers started reviewing his work for plagiarism. Awards committees began reconsidering honors they'd bestowed. The edifice of reputation Weller had built over 23 years was cracking, and everyone could hear it. The university finally acted not out of principle, but out of self-preservation. 2 days before their deadline, President Catherine Morrison called a press conference of her own. Deshawn watched it in Dr. Caldwell's office, surrounded by the small group of people who'd become his allies in this fight. Dr. Caldwell herself, Jasmine Tucker, Richard Chen, and his mother, who'd driven up from home to be with him for this moment. President Morrison stood at a podium bearing the Ashford University seal, her expression grave. After extensive review of serious allegations regarding Professor Malcolm Weller's conduct, she began, her voice formal and carefully controlled, "The university has concluded that significant questions exist regarding the originality and attribution of work published under Professor Weller's name over the past 2 decades. We are establishing a formal investigative committee composed of external experts in mathematics ethics to conduct a comprehensive review of Professor Weller's publication record. Professor Weller has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of this investigation." Deshawn felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief exactly, but a sense that finally, after 23 years, someone in power was acknowledging what had happened. But Morrison wasn't finished. "Additionally, we are conducting a thorough review of our academic integrity processes to understand how these issues were not identified and addressed earlier. As part of this review, we will be examining the case of James Reed, a former graduate student whose accusations against Professor Weller in 2002 were not adequately investigated. The university deeply regrets any failure to protect Mr. Reed and take his allegations seriously." Diane Reed made a sound, something between a sob and a laugh, and reached for Deshawn's hand. "Finally," Morrison continued, "we will be establishing the James Reed Memorial Scholarship for students in mathematics, with a particular focus on supporting those who might face barriers to pursuing advanced study in the field. We cannot undo the past, but we can honor Mr. Reed's memory and ensure that the brilliant work he produced receives the recognition it deserves." The press conference continued with questions from reporters, but Deshawn had stopped listening. He was looking at his mother, seeing tears streaming down her face, and understanding that this moment, this public acknowledgement of his father's name, this admission that James Reed had been wronged, was something she'd never thought she'd witness. "He would be so proud of you," Diane whispered. "So proud." "We did it together," Deshawn replied. "You kept his work safe. You raised me to know I deserved to be in those rooms, even when people tried to tell me otherwise. This is as much your victory as it is mine." Dr. Caldwell turned away from the screen. "This is just the beginning, you know. The formal investigation will take months. Weller will fight every step of the way. And even when it's over, there will be people who doubt, who claim the university caved to pressure, who say this was all politically motivated." "Let them doubt," Deshawn said. "The evidence speaks for itself. And now it's finally going to be examined by people who care about truth more than reputation." Richard Chen cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology, Deshawn, and your mother. If I'd had your courage 23 years ago, none of this would have been necessary. James would still be alive. You'd have grown up with your father." Deshawn looked at the elderly professor, saw the genuine remorse in his face, and felt the anger he'd carried toward him soften slightly. "You came forward when it mattered. You told the truth even though it cost you. That's what my father needed then, and that's what I needed now. Thank you." They sat together in the office as evening fell outside, watching the news cycle pick up the story, watching commentators debate what this meant for academic integrity, watching the name James Reed trend on social media as mathematicians around the world began discovering the brilliant work that had been hidden for so long. And somewhere in the midst of all that noise, all that attention, all that validation, Deshaun felt his father's presence, not as a ghost or a haunting, but as a legacy finally being acknowledged. The invisible man who'd been erased was becoming visible again, one news article, one testimony, one verified proof at a time. The fight wasn't over. Weller's lawsuit was still pending. The investigation would take months, and there would be countless more battles before justice was fully served. But for the first time in 23 years, James Reed's son could breathe without the weight of carrying an impossible secret alone. The truth was out. The fight was public, and this time they were going to win. The External Review Committee convened in early November, 6 weeks after President Morrison's press conference, and Deshaun found himself sitting in a conference room he'd never expected to enter. The same room where his father's academic integrity hearing had taken place 23 years earlier. Dr. Caldwell had told him this detail quietly, almost apologetically, as if the universe had a cruel sense of symmetry. But Deshaun saw it differently. His father had walked into this room alone and left it destroyed. Deshaun was walking in with an army. The committee consisted of 5 distinguished mathematicians from institutions across the country, none with any prior connection to Ashford University or Malcolm Weller. They'd spent the past month reviewing hundreds of documents, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing the mathematical content at the heart of the allegations. Now they were ready to hear directly from the key parties involved. Weller arrived first, flanked by 2 attorneys and wearing an expression of weary martyrdom that Deshaun recognized as performance. The professor had aged in the past 2 months. His hair seemed grayer, his face more drawn, but his eyes still held that calculating intelligence, that predatory assessment of everyone in the room. When his gaze landed on Deshaun, something flickered there, too quick to fully identify. Hatred, maybe, or fear masquerading as hatred. "Thank you all for coming," began Dr. Pauline Webster, the committee chair and a professor emeritus from Berkeley. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd spent 40 years in academia learning to smell bullshit from a mile away. "We've conducted extensive analysis of the materials submitted by both parties. Today, we'll be asking questions to clarify certain points and to give everyone an opportunity to address the evidence directly." She opened a folder in front of her. "Professor Weller, let's begin with you. We've reviewed the publication history and noticed something curious. Your most innovative work, the papers that established your reputation, were all published between 1999 and 2003. After that, your publications became progressively more incremental, more derivative. Can you explain this pattern?" Weller leaned forward, his voice steady and professorial. "It's quite common for mathematicians to do their most groundbreaking work earlier in their careers. The low-hanging fruit, so to speak, gets picked first. Later work tends to be more about refinement and application." "Except that's not quite true," interjected Dr. Michael Torres, another committee member. "Many mathematicians continue to produce innovative work throughout their careers. And your early papers didn't just show innovation, they showed methodological approaches that were years ahead of the field, approaches that then seemed to vanish from your subsequent work." "I'm not sure I understand the question," Weller replied, but Deshaun could see the tension in his shoulders. Dr. Webster pulled out several papers and spread them across the table. "We're specifically interested in your 2001 paper on elliptic curves, which introduced what became known as the Weller method, but which Mr. Reed's documentation refers to as Method C. Can you walk us through how you developed this approach?" For the first time, Weller hesitated. "It was years ago. The specific details of the development process. Surely you remember how you developed the method that made you famous," Dr. Torres said, and there was an edge to his voice now. "We're not asking for every calculation. We're asking for the conceptual breakthrough. What insight led you to this approach?" Weller's jaw tightened. "As I've stated in my written responses, the development of mathematical methods is often collaborative and evolutionary. Ideas build on conversations, informal exchanges, the general intellectual environment of a department. That's not what we asked," Dr. Webster interrupted. "We asked how you specifically developed it. What was your insight?" The silence that followed was damning. Weller looked at his attorneys, who could only offer neutral expressions. He looked at the committee members who were waiting with the patience of people who already knew the answer but wanted to hear him admit it. The method emerged from my work with graduate students, Weller said finally. From supervising their research and synthesizing various approaches into a coherent framework. By graduate students, do you mean James Reed? Asked Dr. Linda Chen, the youngest committee member, a professor from Stanford. James was one of several students I advised at that time. Was he the one who developed Method C? I don't accept the premise of that question. The distinction between an advisor's contribution and a student's contribution is often blurred in graduate research. Professor Weller, Dr. Webster cut in, her voice sharp now. We have James Reed's notebooks, dated and authenticated, showing the development of this method over the course of 18 months. We have correspondence where James explicitly describes the method to you. We have testimony from Professor Richard Chen stating that he witnessed James present this work to you as his advisor. What we don't have is any documentation showing your independent development of this method. So I'm going to ask you one more time, very directly. Did you develop Method C or did James Reed? The room held its breath. Deshawn's hands were clenched in his lap, his nails digging into his palms. This was the moment, the direct confrontation his father had never gotten, the question that had been buried for 23 years. Weller's face had gone pale, but his voice remained controlled. I refuse to answer questions that are clearly designed to entrap me rather than seek truth. My attorneys have advised me that this committee's proceedings have become biased and prosecutorial. Your attorneys can advise you however they like, Dr. Webster replied coldly. But this committee was assembled specifically to determine the truth about these allegations, and your refusal to answer direct questions about your own work is itself rather telling. One of Weller's attorneys leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear. Weller listened, his expression darkening, then turned back to the committee. I'm terminating my participation in these proceedings, he announced. This is not an objective investigation. It's a witch hunt designed to destroy my reputation based on ancient grudges and fabricated evidence. I will not dignify it with further cooperation. He stood abruptly, his attorneys scrambling to follow. As they moved toward the door, Dr. Torres called after them. Professor Weller, before you leave, I want you to know that we've also interviewed 7 of your former graduate students. All 7 described the same pattern, sharing their innovative work with you as their advisor, then watching you publish it under your name with minimal or no attribution. That's not ancient history. That's a decades-long pattern of theft. Weller paused at the door, his back to the committee. For a moment, Deshawn thought he might turn around, might finally confess, might show some shred of remorse or acknowledgement. Instead, he walked out without another word, his attorneys trailing behind him like attendants leaving with a deposed king. The door closed, and the committee members sat in silence for a long moment. Well, Dr. Webster said finally, that was illuminating. She turned to Deshawn. Mr. Reed, would you please join us at the table? Deshawn stood on shaking legs and moved to the seat Weller had just vacated. It felt surreal to be sitting where his father's accuser had been, to be facing the kind of panel that had destroyed his father's life, except this time the panel was actually listening. First, Dr. Webster began, her tone softening considerably. I want to apologize on behalf of the academic community for what happened to your father. The review committee that handled his case in 2002 failed him catastrophically, and the system that should have protected him instead enabled his destruction. Nothing we do now can undo that harm, but please know that we take these proceedings very seriously. Thank you, Deshawn managed. Now, we've reviewed your father's notebooks extensively, and I have to tell you, they're extraordinary. The mathematical insight, the methodological innovation, the sheer creativity of the approaches he developed. Your father was genuinely brilliant. Dr. Linda Chen pulled out one of the notebooks. We'd like to ask you some questions about your own training. You've stated that you taught yourself advanced mathematics using these notebooks. Can you tell us more about that process? For the next hour, Deshawn walked the committee through his journey, finding the notebooks at 15, not understanding them at first, spending years teaching himself the foundations he needed to comprehend his father's work. The late nights working through proofs, the moment when Method C finally clicked in his mind, and he understood not just how it worked, but why it was revolutionary. And when Professor Weller challenged you in class, You were able to apply Method C to a novel problem in under 2 minutes, Dr. Torres said. That suggests genuine understanding, not memorization. I understood it because my father explained it, Deshawn replied. Not directly. He died when I was 3, but through his notebooks, through the way he showed his work, explained his reasoning, left notes about why certain approaches failed and others succeeded. He was teaching even when he wrote for himself. Dr. Webster looked down at her notes, and when she looked back up, there was something like anger in her eyes. We've also reviewed the proceedings from your father's academic integrity hearing in 2002. The committee that heard his case had all of this evidence, the notebooks, the correspondence, the timeline. They chose not to believe it. They chose to protect Malcolm Weller instead of protecting your father. I want you to know that we will not be making that choice. What happens now? Deshawn asked. We complete our report, Dr. Webster replied. We'll be delivering our findings to the university and publishing them in the Journal of Mathematical Ethics. Based on what we've seen, those findings will be unambiguous. Malcolm Weller systematically plagiarized James Reed's work and built his career on that theft. He then used his position to suppress your father's attempts to clear his name, and the evidence suggests he continued this pattern with multiple other students over the following 2 decades. How long until the report is finished? 2 weeks. We're being thorough because we know Weller will challenge every conclusion, every piece of evidence, every statement we make. But the mathematics doesn't lie, Mr. Reed. Your father's genius is evident in every page of these notebooks, and it's equally evident that Weller doesn't actually understand the methods he claimed to develop. Dr. Torres leaned forward. There's something else you should know. We've been contacted by the Office of Research Integrity, which oversees federal research grants. They're opening their own investigation into Weller's entire body of work. If they find what we've found, he could face federal sanctions, loss of grant eligibility, and potential criminal charges for research fraud. Deshawn felt something like vertigo, the sense that this was spiraling into something far bigger than he'd imagined. Criminal charges? If Weller used federal grant money to support research that was actually plagiarized, that's fraud. The government takes that very seriously. Dr. Torres's expression was grim. Malcolm Weller is facing the possibility of losing everything: his reputation, his position, his pension, potentially his freedom. All because he couldn't admit that a brilliant black graduate student was more talented than him. The committee continued asking questions for another hour, but Deshawn could barely focus. The magnitude of what was happening, the cascading consequences of that single moment when he'd stood at the blackboard and solved an impossible equation, kept washing over him in waves. When the session finally ended, Dr. Caldwell was waiting outside with Jasmine Tucker and Richard Chen. They'd been observing from a separate room, watching via video feed. You did beautifully, Dr. Caldwell said, pulling Deshawn into a hug. You were clear, honest, and dignified. Everything your father would have been if he'd been given the same fair hearing. Weller walked out, Deshawn said, still processing it. He just walked out. Because he knew he couldn't answer their questions, Richard said quietly. Because they were asking him to explain work he never actually understood. I saw the same thing in faculty meetings over the years. Malcolm was brilliant at presenting ideas, at packaging them, at making them accessible. But when you pushed him on the fundamental insights on where ideas came from, he'd deflect or pivot to something else. I always wondered about that. Now I know why. They walked across campus together, and Deshawn noticed something he hadn't seen before. Students recognizing him, nodding in respect or giving him thumbs up. His story had spread through Ashford like wildfire. He wasn't invisible anymore. He was the student who'd exposed a fraud, who'd fought for his father's legacy, who'd proven that even the most powerful people could be held accountable. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt exhausting. That evening, Deshawn returned to his apartment to find his mother waiting on the front steps. She'd driven up without telling him, carrying a bag of groceries and wearing an expression that was part concern, part determination. You look like you need a home-cooked meal, Diane said by way of greeting. Mom, you didn't have to. Yes, I did. Because I know what you're feeling right now, and I know you need someone to take care of you while you're taking care of everything else. They went inside, and while Diane cooked, Deshaun sat at the small kitchen table and finally let himself feel the weight of the past 2 months. The anger, the fear, the determination, all of it had been fuel driving him forward. But now, with the committee's findings forthcoming, with Weller's empire crumbling, Deshaun felt the exhaustion that had been accumulating in his bones. "Your father went through this alone," Diane said, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. The stress of fighting, the constant anxiety, the knowledge that powerful people wanted him to disappear. It ate him alive, baby. Not just the losing, the fighting itself. "I'm okay, Mom." "You're not okay. You're surviving. There's a difference." She turned to face him. "And I need you to promise me something. When this is over, when the committee releases their report and Weller faces whatever consequences he faces, I need you to let it go. To not let this fight define your entire life the way it defined your father's." "How can I let it go?" "This is about Dad's legacy." "Your father's legacy is you," Diane interrupted firmly. "It's not the methods he developed or the papers that should have borne his name. It's the brilliant, courageous, principled young man sitting in front of me. You've already honored James more than he could have ever dreamed. You proved his work was real. You forced the world to acknowledge his genius. You cleared his name. That's enough, baby. That's more than enough." Deshaun felt tears burning his eyes. "But it's not finished. The committee still has to release their findings. Weller might fight back. The university might try to settle quietly. And if they do, you'll have still accomplished something your father never could. You made them look. You made them care. You turned his name from an erased footnote into a memorial scholarship. Whatever else happens, that's victory." They ate together in comfortable silence, and Deshaun let himself imagine what it might be like to be a regular student again, to attend classes without being recognized, to study mathematics for the joy of it rather than as a weapon against injustice. The thought was simultaneously appealing and impossible. He'd been transformed by this fight. There was no going back to who he'd been. The 2 weeks before the committee's report was released felt like the longest of Deshaun's life. He tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, attending his other classes, working his part-time job at the library, studying for exams. But mathematics had become complicated for him now, tangled up with his father's ghost and Weller's crimes, and the weight of representing something larger than himself. Dr. Caldwell checked in daily, making sure he was eating and sleeping and not drowning in the pressure. Jasmine Tucker had become an unexpected friend, someone who understood what it meant to be trapped between speaking truth and protecting your future. And Richard Chen stopped by once a week, ostensibly to discuss mathematics, but really, Deshaun suspected, because the elderly professor was trying to assuage decades of guilt by mentoring the son of the man he'd failed to protect. "Have you thought about what you'll do after graduation?" Richard asked during one of their sessions. "I'm a sophomore. Graduation is years away. Time moves faster than you think, and you've demonstrated abilities that would make you competitive for any graduate program in the country." Richard paused. "But I imagine the idea of graduate school might be complicated for you now." "You think I don't want to be anyone's advisee after what Weller did to my father?" "I think you might have complicated feelings about academic hierarchies and power dynamics, yes." Deshaun was quiet for a moment. "I used to think I wanted to be invisible. Safe. That if I just kept my head down and didn't attract attention, I could get through school and get a job and live a normal life. But this fight, standing up for my father, exposing Weller, it showed me that invisibility is just another form of erasure. My father was erased. Jasmine and David and all of Weller's other victims were erased. And I was erasing myself voluntarily, which is maybe the saddest kind. So what will you do instead? I don't know yet. But I know I can't go back to hiding, and I know I want to use mathematics for something that matters. Maybe that means research, maybe teaching, maybe something I haven't imagined yet. But whatever it is, I want it to be honest. I want it to be mine." Richard nodded slowly. "Your father would be proud, not just of what you've accomplished, but of who you're becoming." The committee's report was released on a Wednesday morning in late November, 2 days before Thanksgiving. Dr. Webster held a press conference to present the findings, and Deshaun watched it from Dr. Caldwell's office, surrounded by the small group of people who'd become his chosen family through this ordeal. After exhaustive review of documentary evidence, witness testimony, and mathematical analysis, Dr. Webster announced to a room packed with reporters and cameras, this committee has concluded that Professor Malcolm Weller engaged in systematic academic fraud spanning more than 2 decades. Specifically, we find that Professor Weller plagiarized groundbreaking mathematical methods developed by James Reed, his graduate advisee, in 1999 and 2000, and published this work under his own name in 2001 after orchestrating Mr. Reed's expulsion from Ashford University. The cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. Dr. Webster continued, her voice steady and damning. Furthermore, we have identified a pattern of similar theft involving at least 8 other students and junior colleagues over the following 20 years. The methods Professor Weller claimed as his innovations were, in fact, the intellectual property of others, which he appropriated through his position of power and authority. Our review of his independent work reveals that Professor Weller's genuine mathematical contributions were minimal and derivative. In essence, Malcolm Weller built a distinguished career on stolen brilliance. She paused to let that sink in. We are recommending that Ashford University revoke Professor Weller's tenure, terminate his employment, and take steps to correct the academic record by properly attributing work to its original creators. We are further recommending that professional mathematics organizations review all honors and awards bestowed upon Professor Weller, as they were obtained through fraudulent means. Finally, we are forwarding our findings to the Office of Research Integrity for potential criminal investigation. A reporter shouted a question. What about James Reed? What recognition will he receive? James Reed was a brilliant mathematician whose life and career were destroyed by academic fraud and institutional failure, Dr. Webster replied, and there was emotion in her voice now. This committee recommends that James Reed be posthumously awarded the PhD he was denied, that his work be properly published under his name, and that Ashford University take meaningful steps to ensure that no other student ever suffers the fate that Mr. Reed did. In Dr. Caldwell's office, Diane Reed was crying openly. Deshaun held his mother's hand and felt something release inside him, not joy exactly, but a sense of completion. The truth was out, official, undeniable. His father's name was cleared. "We did it, Mom," he whispered. "We actually did it." "James would be so proud," she replied through tears. "So proud of you." The press conference continued with more questions, more details, more damning revelations about Weller's systematic theft. But Deshaun had stopped listening. He was thinking about his father, about the brilliant young man who died believing he was a failure, believing he was a liar, believing the world had rejected him for telling the truth. He pulled out his phone and composed a text to the group chat he'd formed with Jasmine, David, and the other victims who'd come forward. "Justice," he typed. "Finally." The responses came quickly: relief, gratitude, validation. And from David, "Your father paved the road we all just walked. Thank you for finishing his journey." Malcolm Weller's response came later that afternoon, not as a statement, but as action. He filed a lawsuit against the committee, against Ashford University, and against Deshaun personally, claiming defamation, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges that his attorneys had clearly spent weeks preparing. The lawsuit was enormous, hundreds of pages, and it sought millions in damages. But it landed like a rock thrown at a tidal wave. Public opinion had already turned decisively against Weller. The committee's report was being covered by every major news outlet. Mathematics departments across the country were distancing themselves from him. His publishers were pulling his books from circulation pending review. Awards committees were rescinding honors. The American Mathematical Society was discussing expelling him from the organization. And most devastatingly, 3 major universities announced they were conducting their own reviews of papers he'd published while affiliated with their institutions, looking for evidence of plagiarism or fraud. When universities start protecting themselves by investigating someone, that person has already lost. Deshaun's attorney, provided pro bono by a firm that specialized in academic fraud cases, called him that evening with the assessment. "Weller's lawsuit is a Hail Mary," the attorney explained. "He's hoping to intimidate you into settling, to create enough legal chaos that people stop paying attention to the committee's findings. But it won't work. The evidence is too strong, the pattern too clear. We'll file a motion to dismiss, and even if the case proceeds, you're protected by truth as a defense. Everything you've said about Weller is supported by documented evidence. So I don't need to worry? I didn't say that. Lawsuits are stressful and expensive even when you're going to win. But you should know that Weller is the one who needs to worry. His legal situation gets worse by the day. That prediction proved accurate. 2 weeks after the committee's report, the Office of Research Integrity announced they were opening a formal investigation into Weller's use of federal grant money. 3 weeks after that, Ashford University's Board of Trustees voted unanimously to revoke his tenure and terminate his employment, citing academic fraud and violation of professional ethics. And 1 month after the report, the American Mathematical Society formally expelled him, the first time they'd taken such action in the organization's 130-year history. Malcolm Weller's empire didn't just crumble. It was systematically dismantled, piece by piece, by the same institutions that had built him up. And through it all, Deshaun watched with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, because the truth was that destroying Weller's legacy didn't bring his father back. It didn't give him the childhood he'd lost, the relationship he'd never had, the chance to hear his father say he was proud. But it did something else, something his mother had tried to tell him, but that he'd only now fully understood. It proved that his father had been right, that James Reed had been telling the truth about his work, about his brilliance, about the theft he'd suffered. And sometimes being proven right matters more than any other kind of justice, because it transforms you from victim to prophet, from dismissed to validated, from erased to remembered. James Reed would be remembered now, not as a cautionary tale or a tragic figure, but as a brilliant mathematician who'd been destroyed by an unjust system and vindicated by his son's refusal to accept that injustice. That was the legacy Deshaun had fought for. And finally, impossibly, he'd won it. Spring arrived at Ashford University with the kind of determined optimism that only comes after a brutal winter, and Deshaun Reed found himself walking across campus with a sense of purpose that felt both familiar and entirely new. 6 months had passed since the committee's report, and the landscape of his life had transformed in ways he was still learning to navigate. The student who'd once perfected invisibility was now stopped regularly by classmates wanting to shake his hand, by professors inviting him to join their research projects, by reporters still hoping for one more quote about the scandal that had rocked the mathematics world. But this morning, he wasn't thinking about any of that. He was heading to the administration building for a meeting that felt like the final chapter of a story that had begun decades before he was born. President Catherine Morrison's office was nothing like the conference rooms where Deshaun had fought his battles. It was warm, filled with natural light, decorated with art from local students and photographs of campus traditions spanning generations. Morrison herself rose from behind her desk as he entered, extending her hand with an expression that seemed genuinely pleased rather than performative. "Mr. Reed, thank you for coming. Please, sit." Deshaun took the offered chair, noting that his mother was already there, seated on a small sofa near the window. Diane smiled at him, and he could see she'd been crying, but these were good tears, the kind that came from relief rather than grief. "I asked you both here today," Morrison began, settling into the chair across from them, "because I wanted to deliver some news personally rather than through official channels. As you know, the university has been conducting a comprehensive review of how we failed James Reed 23 years ago, and what systemic changes we need to make to ensure such failures never happen again." "I've been following the reform proposals," Deshaun said carefully. He'd been consulted on several of them: new protections for graduate students, independent review processes for academic disputes, mandatory training on power dynamics and bias. Changes that should have existed all along but that had required a catastrophic failure to implement. "Those reforms are moving forward," Morrison confirmed. "But there's something more specific to your father that I wanted to discuss. The Board of Trustees met yesterday and voted unanimously on several measures." She pulled out a folder and opened it, though Deshaun suspected she'd memorized every word. "First, we are posthumously awarding James Reed the PhD he was denied. His dissertation committee will be reconvened with new members who will review his original work that, as the external committee confirmed, was more than sufficient for doctoral completion." Diane made a soft sound, her hand going to her mouth. Deshaun reached over and took her other hand, squeezing gently. Morrison continued, her voice steady but touched with emotion. "Second, We are formally rescinding the academic integrity violations that were unjustly placed on James Reed's record. The university acknowledges that these charges were baseless, that they were used to cover up Malcolm Weller's theft, and that they caused immeasurable harm to Mr. Reed and his family. "Thank you," Diane whispered, and Deshawn could hear 23 years of waiting in those two words. Third, we are publishing James Reed's original work, the methods and proofs he developed, in a special memorial volume through the university press. We've already had interest from major mathematics publishers about wider distribution. Your father's genius will finally be recognized in the academic record where it belongs. Morrison paused, looking between Deshawn and his mother. And fourth, we've established the James Reed Chair in Mathematics, an endowed professorship that will focus on mentoring students from underrepresented backgrounds and supporting innovative research. The position comes with full funding for the professor's own research, as well as support for graduate students. Deshawn felt his breath catch. A chair, one of the highest honors a university could bestow, a permanent position that would carry his father's name for generations. That's incredible. "It's the least we can do," Morrison said quietly. "Though I want to be clear, nothing we do can truly compensate for what was taken from your father, from your family. James Reed should have had a long, celebrated career. He should have seen his son grow up. He should have been here to witness your brilliance, Deshawn, and to know that his legacy lived on not just in notebooks, but in you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment the three of them sat in shared acknowledgement of an absence that could never be filled, a loss that could only be honored, never repaired. "There's one more thing," Morrison said, and now she pulled out a different document. "The university would like to offer you, Deshawn, a full scholarship for the remainder of your undergraduate education, plus guaranteed funding for graduate school should you choose to pursue your PhD here at Ashford. And we'd like to invite you to be the first student supported by the James Reed Chair once that position is filled." Deshawn stared at her, processing what this meant. Financial security, recognition, the chance to study mathematics without the constant anxiety about tuition and rent, the opportunity to work with a professor specifically chosen to support students like him. "I don't know what to say," he managed finally. "Say you'll think about it," Morrison replied. "I know Ashford holds complicated memories for you and your family. If you choose to transfer, if you decide you need distance from the institution that failed your father, we'll understand and provide excellent recommendations. But if you stay, we want to make sure you have every resource and support you deserve." After the meeting, Deshawn and his mother walked through campus together, and Diane kept stopping to look at buildings, at students hurrying between classes, at the mathematics department where her husband had once studied and died trying to defend his truth. "I haven't been on this campus in 23 years, she said quietly. "I swore I'd never set foot here again after James's funeral. After watching them eulogize him with empty words while protecting the man who destroyed him. We don't have to stay, Mom. We can leave." "No." Diane turned to face him, and her expression was fierce. "No, I need to see this, all of it. Because this place was stolen from James, and now we're taking it back. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with truth. With recognition. With his name on a chair and a scholarship and a published volume of his work. They tried to erase him, baby, and instead we made him permanent." They walked to the mathematics building, and Deshawn led his mother to the second floor, where a new plaque had been installed just that week. It was simple, elegant, mounted on the wall outside what had once been Weller's office, and was now being converted into a study space for graduate students. The plaque read, "In memory of James Reed, Ph.D., brilliant mathematician, 1975 to 2002. His work illuminated paths others feared to walk." Diane reached out and touched the bronze surface, tracing her husband's name with shaking fingers. "He would have hated the attention," she said with a watery laugh. "James was so private, so focused on the work itself rather than recognition. But he would have loved knowing that students coming after him would benefit from what he discovered." "He's teaching them even now," Deshawn said. "Through the notebooks, through the published work, through the methods that are finally being taught under his name instead of Weller's." They stood there for a long moment, and Deshaun thought about all the times he'd walked past this building, deliberately not looking up, trying to remain invisible. Now he was standing in front of his father's memorial with his head held high, visible in a way that no longer felt dangerous, but powerful. The sound of footsteps made them turn. Dr. Caldwell was approaching with someone Deshaun didn't recognize, a black woman in her 40s, professionally dressed, carrying a leather bag that looked expensive and well-worn. "Deshaun, Diane, I'm so glad we caught you," Dr. Caldwell said, slightly out of breath from hurrying. "This is Dr. Imani Wright. She's a professor at Howard University, and she's been following your story very closely." Dr. Wright extended her hand, first to Diane, then to Deshaun. "It's an honor to meet you both. James Reed's work has been making waves in mathematics departments across the country since the committee's report. Several of us have been incorporating his methods into our graduate curricula." "Really?" Deshaun asked, surprised. "Absolutely. Method C alone is revolutionizing how we approach certain classes of problems. But beyond the technical contributions, your father's story, and yours, Deshaun, has sparked crucial conversations about power dynamics in academia, about how brilliance gets recognized and stolen, about who gets protected and who gets destroyed." Dr. Wright's expression was intense, passionate. "I came here today specifically to meet you and to make an offer." "What kind of offer?" "I'm organizing a special conference this summer, Hidden Figures in Modern Mathematics. We're highlighting brilliant mathematicians whose work was stolen, suppressed, or erased, particularly those from marginalized communities. Your father will be one of our featured case studies, and I'd like you to present his work, not as a victim's son, but as a mathematician in your own right who has mastered these methods and can demonstrate their applications." Deshaun felt his pulse quicken. "You want me to present at an academic conference?" "I want you to show the mathematics community what James Reed created and what his son has built upon it. You've already proven you have the talent. Now I'm offering you a platform." Dr. Wright pulled out a folder from her bag. "This is the conference program. We have attendees confirmed from over 30 countries, including some of the most respected mathematicians in the world. They want to hear about your father. They want to see his methods in action. And they want to meet the young man who exposed one of the biggest frauds in academic history." Deshaun looked at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. Then he looked at Dr. Caldwell, who was beaming with pride. Finally, he looked back at Dr. Wright and said, "I'll do it." The next 3 months were a whirlwind of preparation. Deshaun worked with Dr. Caldwell and Dr. Wright to develop a presentation that honored his father's original insights while demonstrating his own extensions of that work. He practiced in front of small groups, then larger ones, learning to speak about mathematics with confidence, rather than hiding his understanding behind deliberate mediocrity. Jasmine Tucker, who'd been accepted into a PhD program at MIT, far from Weller's influence, helped him refine his slides. Richard Chen provided historical context about the mathematics community in his father's era, and Professor Margaret Foster from MIT, who'd been instrumental in publicizing the scandal, offered to introduce him at the conference. But the most meaningful preparation came from unexpected sources. David Chen, the former student who'd left mathematics entirely after Weller stole his work, reached out to say he was returning to graduate school. "Your fight gave me my passion back," he wrote. "I'm not going to let Weller steal my future along with my past." 3 other victims came forward with similar stories. They'd left mathematics, left academia, left careers they'd loved because Weller had convinced them they weren't good enough, that their work wasn't original, that they didn't belong. Now they were reclaiming those stolen dreams, and they credited Deshaun's refusal to disappear as the catalyst for their own courage. The conference was held at Howard University in mid-July, and when Deshaun walked into the lecture hall for his presentation, he was shocked to find it packed. Every seat was filled, people standing along the walls, faces of all ages and backgrounds united in their desire to hear about James Reed. Professor Foster made the introduction, her voice carrying authority and emotion in equal measure. 23 years ago, a brilliant young mathematician named James Reed was destroyed by a system that valued reputation over truth. Today his son is going to show us what was lost and what has been reclaimed. Deshaun stepped to the podium, and for just a moment, he was that terrified sophomore again, standing at a blackboard in front of people who didn't think he belonged. But then he saw his mother in the front row, saw Dr. Caldwell and Dr. Wright and Jasmine and all the people who'd fought alongside him, and he remembered something his father had written in one of the notebooks. Mathematics doesn't care about fear. It only cares about truth. My father, James Reed, developed what became known as Method C when he was 24 years old, Deshaun began, his voice steady. He was a graduate student working on problems that had stumped established mathematicians for decades, and he solved them. Not through luck or accident, but through genuine insight, creative thinking, and a willingness to see patterns others missed. He advanced his slide to show the first page of his father's notebook, the careful handwriting now projected large enough for everyone to see. This is where it started. A simple question about elliptic curves that led to a revolutionary approach. I'm going to walk you through his reasoning, show you how the method works, and then demonstrate some applications I've developed based on his foundations. For the next 90 minutes, Deshaun did exactly that. He presented his father's work with the clarity and passion of someone who'd spent years living inside these ideas, who'd taught himself advanced mathematics specifically to understand what his father had created. He showed the elegance of Method C, the way it transformed impossible problems into solvable ones, the applications that were still being discovered decades after its development. And then he did something his father never got the chance to do. He extended the work. He showed novel applications he'd developed, problems he'd solved using his father's methods as a foundation, directions the research could go. He wasn't just preserving his father's legacy, he was building on it, proving that James Reed's genius was fertile ground for new discoveries. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet, and Deshaun saw tears on many faces. Mathematicians who understood the tragedy of talent suppressed, who recognized the injustice of brilliance stolen, who were witnessing a son resurrecting his father's voice and letting it speak across decades of enforced silence. The question and answer session lasted over an hour, with mathematicians from around the world asking detailed technical questions that Deshaun answered with increasing confidence. These weren't people trying to trap him or prove he didn't understand his own work. These were colleagues, actual colleagues, engaging with him as an equal, respecting both his father's contributions and his own. Afterward, Deshaun was surrounded by people wanting to talk, to share their own stories of having work stolen or suppressed, to offer collaboration opportunities, to simply say thank you for bringing this injustice to light. He shook dozens of hands, exchanged contact information with professors from institutions he'd only dreamed of attending, and accepted more praise than he'd heard in his entire life. Dr. Wright found him in the chaos. That was extraordinary, Deshaun. You didn't just present your father's work, you claimed your own place in this field. You're a mathematician now, not just James Reed's son or Malcolm Weller's victim. You're Deshaun Reed, and you have your own voice. The words settled into him like seeds finding soil. He was a mathematician. Not despite his father's legacy, not in spite of what Weller had done, but because he'd chosen to stop hiding, to stop being invisible, to stand up and claim his space in rooms that had tried to exclude people like him. That evening, there was a reception, and Deshaun found himself in conversation with Dr. Patricia Nguyen, the newly appointed James Reed Chair at Ashford University. She was a brilliant mathematician in her own right, known for her work on number theory and for her advocacy for underrepresented students. I want you to know, Dr. Nguyen said, that I don't take this position lightly. Carrying your father's name, continuing his legacy, it's a responsibility I'm honored to accept. And I hope you'll work with me, either as a student or colleague. Your father's notebooks have given me enough research directions to last a decade. I'd like that, Deshaun replied, and he realized it was true. Ashford didn't feel like enemy territory anymore. It felt like contested ground that had been reclaimed, transformed from the place that destroyed his father into a place that would honor him. The summer ended, and Deshaun returned to campus for his junior year. He'd decided to stay at Ashford, to complete his undergraduate degree at the institution that had failed his father, but that was now trying, genuinely trying, to do better. He moved out of his cramped apartment into better housing made possible by his scholarship, started working as a research assistant with Dr. Nguyen, and began planning his own graduate research. But the moment that mattered most came on a crisp October morning, almost exactly 1 year after he'd stood at that blackboard and solved Weller's impossible equation. Ashford held a formal ceremony to present Diane Reed with her late husband's PhD diploma. It was held in the same auditorium where commencement ceremonies took place, and the university had invited everyone who'd been part of James Reed's vindication: the external review committee, the victims who'd come forward, the faculty who'd finally told the truth. President Morrison presided, but it was Dr. Caldwell who delivered the main remarks, standing at the podium with tears streaming down her face as she talked about the brilliant young man she'd failed to protect and the son who'd made that failure impossible to ignore. James Reed deserved to stand here 23 years ago and accept this degree surrounded by joy and celebration, Dr. Caldwell said. Instead, he was driven out in shame, labeled a fraud, and denied the recognition he'd earned through extraordinary mathematical brilliance. We cannot undo that injustice. We cannot give him back the years he lost, the career he should have had, the life he deserved to live. But we can finally say, officially and publicly, James Reed was right. His work was original. His genius was real. And we were wrong to doubt him. She paused, composing herself. Today, we award Dr. James Reed his PhD, posthumously but permanently. His dissertation, Novel Approaches to Elliptic Curve Theory, is now part of the academic record. His methods are being taught in classrooms around the world. His name is on a chair, a scholarship, and a memorial that will endure for generations. He is no longer erased. He is visible, honored, and remembered. Diane Reed walked to the stage to accept the diploma, an actual physical diploma, beautifully framed, with her husband's name inscribed in elegant script. She held it like it was made of something infinitely precious and fragile, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the auditorium with perfect clarity. My husband James was the kindest, most brilliant person I've ever known. He loved mathematics the way some people love music or art, completely, obsessively, joyfully. And when that love was turned into a weapon against him, when his brilliance was stolen and his name was destroyed, it broke something in him that couldn't be repaired. She looked out at the audience, at all the people who'd failed her husband and all the people who'd finally made things right. But he would want me to tell you something. He would want me to say that mathematics itself was never the problem. The problem was people who valued power over truth, reputation over integrity, comfort over justice. And the solution, the only solution, is people like my son, like Dr. Caldwell, like Professor Chen, and all the others who refused to let lies stand just because they were convenient. She held up the diploma. This piece of paper doesn't bring James back, but it proves that truth matters, that justice can exist even if it comes late, and that erasure is never permanent when people are willing to fight against it. Thank you all for giving my husband's voice back to him. Thank you for making sure his son grew up knowing his father was a hero, not a failure. Thank you for choosing truth. The applause lasted for minutes, and when it finally died down, President Morrison announced one final element of the ceremony. We'd like to invite Deshaun Reed to the stage. Deshaun, would you join us? Deshaun walked up, confused but trusting, and found himself standing next to his mother as Morrison continued. Deshaun, your courage in exposing academic fraud, your brilliance in mastering your father's methods, and your advocacy for systematic reform have already made you an important figure in mathematics. But we believe your greatest contributions are still ahead of you. So Ashford University would like to offer you the James Reed Graduate Fellowship, full funding for your PhD, with a commitment that you'll be supported, mentored, and celebrated for your own original work, building on your father's legacy, but creating your own. She handed him an envelope, and when Deshaun opened it, he found a letter officially offering him guaranteed admission to Ashford's PhD program with full funding, research support, and a promise that his work would be protected, attributed, and honored. You don't have to accept, Morrison added quietly, just for him. If you need distance from this place, we understand. But if you choose to stay, we want you to know that we will never let what happened to your father happen to you or any other student. That's a promise we're building into policy, into practice, into the culture of this institution. Deshaun looked at his mother, who was crying and smiling simultaneously. He looked at Dr. Caldwell, at Dr. Nguyen, at all the faces of people who'd fought alongside him. And he thought about his father, About the young man who'd walked these halls with hope and talent and trust, who'd been destroyed when that trust was betrayed. "I'll stay," Deshawn said. "Not because I've forgiven what happened, but because leaving would mean letting them win. Staying means transforming this place, making sure my father's name is spoken here with honor, making sure the next brilliant kid who walks through these doors, especially if they look like me, especially if they come from nowhere with nothing but talent, gets protected instead of exploited." He held up the fellowship letter. "My father started a revolution he didn't live to see completed. I'm going to finish it." The following semester, Deshawn walked into his first graduate-level seminar as a junior, 2 years ahead of schedule, but fully prepared. The course was Advanced Number Theory, and it was being taught by Dr. Nguyen using a curriculum that prominently featured James Reed's methods. The first day, Dr. Nguyen wrote on the board, "Method C, developed by Dr. James Reed, 1999. Deshawn sat in the back row, not hiding this time, but choosing his perspective. He watched students lean forward, interested, as Dr. Nguyen explained the revolutionary approach his father had created. He watched them work through problems, struggle with insights, and eventually understand the elegant solution his father had developed. And at the end of class, a young black student approached him hesitantly. She was a freshman, clearly intimidated by everything about the university, carrying herself with the careful invisibility Deshawn recognized from his own past. "Are you Deshawn Reed?" she asked quietly. "Dr. James Reed's son?" "I am." "I'm here on the James Reed Scholarship," she said, and pride and nervousness mixed in her voice. "I'm from Detroit, first-generation college student, and I never thought I'd get to study math at a place like this. But when I got the scholarship, when I read about your father and what he did and what you did, it made me think maybe I belong here after all." Deshawn felt something shift inside him, some final piece of healing clicking into place. His father's legacy wasn't just about mathematics or justice or vindication. It was about this: a young woman who could walk through doors that had been closed to people like them, who could study mathematics without fear, who could see herself in a story of brilliance recognized rather than suppressed. "You absolutely belong here," Deshawn told her. "And if anyone ever makes you feel like you don't, you come find me. Because my father spent his life proving that talent has no color, no class, no prerequisites except passion and work. And I spend mine making sure nobody forgets that lesson." She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd just been given permission to be brilliant. That evening, Deshawn returned to his apartment and pulled out his father's notebooks one more time. He'd been through them hundreds of times by now, had memorized entire sections, had extended their ideas in directions his father never got to explore. But tonight, he wasn't looking for mathematics. He was looking for the man behind the equations. On the inside cover of the coffee-stained notebook, his father had written something Deshawn had read before but never fully understood. "Mathematics is truth made visible. When we solve problems, we're not inventing. We're discovering what was always there, hidden in the structure of reality itself. And that's why they can't really steal our work. They can take credit, take awards, take recognition, but they can't take the moment of discovery, that instant when invisible patterns suddenly become clear. That belongs to us alone. That's the real reward." Deshawn understood now. Weller had stolen credit, stolen recognition, stolen his father's career and future in life. But he'd never actually possessed what James Reed created, because possession required understanding, and Weller had never truly understood. He'd been performing mathematics he couldn't have developed himself, speaking words in a language he didn't genuinely know. The truth had always been there, waiting in dusty notebooks in a grandmother's attic, waiting for someone who could actually understand it to bring it back to light. And now it was visible not just to Deshawn, but to the entire mathematical world. His father's voice was speaking through textbooks, through lectures, through the work of students who'd never met him, but who benefited from his genius. That was immortality. Not fame or honor or recognition, though those had finally come. Real immortality was being so brilliant that your ideas outlived the people who tried to suppress them, so transformative that erasure became impossible. James Reed was immortal now, and Deshawn had made it so. He closed the notebook and placed it carefully on his desk next to his acceptance letter for the PhD program, next to the photo of his father he'd finally been able to look at without overwhelming grief, Next to the email from Dr. Wright saying his conference presentation was being published in a major journal under his own name. Deshaun Reed, mathematician, not just James Reed's son. Tomorrow he'd go back to class, back to research, back to the work of transforming a system that had failed his father. But tonight, he let himself rest in the knowledge that the impossible equation had been solved. Not the mathematical one Weller had written on the board, but the human one. How do you clear the name of someone who's gone? How do you fight power with nothing but truth? How do you transform invisibility into legacy? The answer, Deshaun had learned, was simple and brutal and beautiful. You refuse to disappear. You stand up even when standing costs you everything. You fight not alone but alongside everyone else who's been erased, suppressed, stolen from. You force the truth into light no matter how many people want it to stay buried. And eventually, impossibly, you win, not by destroying your enemies, though that happened too, not by seeking revenge, though justice came. You win by ensuring that the people who were supposed to disappear become impossible to forget, by turning their silenced voices into choruses that echo through generations, by making their names into memorials, scholarships, chairs, and legacies that transform the institutions that tried to erase them. You win by making sure that when young students walk into mathematics classrooms anywhere in the world, they learn about James Reed, not as a tragedy or a cautionary tale, but as a brilliant mathematician whose methods revolutionized the field and whose son made sure the truth could never be buried again. That was victory. That was justice. That was love made visible through the only language that mattered to James Reed: mathematics, truth, and the refusal to let brilliance be extinguished just because it wore an unexpected face. Deshaun Reed turned off the light in his apartment, but the notebooks remained on his desk, their pages filled with elegant proofs and revolutionary insights, no longer hidden, but finally, permanently, gloriously visible to anyone who cared to see. The impossible equation had been solved. The invisible man had been made visible, and a son had kept his promise to a father he barely remembered but would never forget. The story was complete.